What if the most radioactive place on Earth isn't just toxic to the body but to truth itself? Chernobyl didn't just melt down a reactor, it shattered reality. In its ashes, ghost roads that vanish, rivers that whisper, forests that remember you. For every answer we've scraped from its ruins, 100 new questions grow back, glowing in the dark. Welcome to 99 Chernobyl Mysteries That Cannot Be Explained. Journey into a place where science blinks, time folds, and the dead forget to stay dead. You won't find closure here, just the sound of a Geiger counter and something breathing underneath it. If you've made it this far and your lights haven't flickered, yet consider subscribing. We dive into this kind of beautifully broken mystery all the time. And while the zone doesn't care where you're from, I do drop a comment with your location and the exact time you're listening. Because something tells me it's always a little past midnight when the strange starts to make sense. The Blackbird Prophecy. In the Slavic tongues of another age, the word Pripyat meant one thing, to burn, or more poetically, that which is set alight. Not an omen, not a warning, just a name. Assigned long before the fires came, long before graphite chunks the size of corpses rained down like divine judgment, long before Reactor 4 belched radioactive truth into the night. It was a name etched into maps and bureaucratic paperwork, innocent on paper and terrifying in hindsight. But this linguistic coincidence, if you can even call it that, became a prophecy whispered about in retrospect, too precise to ignore and too ancient to dismiss. Some linguists later claimed the root is older than the Russian tongue itself, dating back to Proto-Slavic days when the forests here were deeper and the superstitions thicker. In those days, the idea of something being set alight didn't just refer to fire. It could mean cleansing or curse, both. So, when the town was named, was it just administrative randomness? Or was it some strange, unconscious act of prophecy language reaching forward to name what had already, in some paradoxical way, happened? The name Pripyat was meant to house workers, not ghosts. But now it's a word that burns in the mouths of survivors, linguistically cursed, long before the Geiger counters started screaming. And this wasn't the only thing the zone named before it destroyed. The phantom decontamination teams. In the chaos of late April 1986, stories began circulating, quiet, uncertain, and always secondhand, of men in unmarked suits arriving at irradiated sites before the official cleanup began. No insignia, no documents, no faces anyone could remember clearly. They came in the night. They brought strange equipment. They didn't follow protocols. Then they vanished. The official record insists decontamination started on the 27th of April, but residents from scattered outposts deeper in the zone swear they saw masked men 2 days earlier. Their movements were surgical. Their targets weren't always logical. Why decontaminate an abandoned bus stop in a forest or a collapsed barn with no tactical value? And why carry instruments that hummed louder than Geiger counters and gave off a bluish glow? Liquidators who came later sometimes found patches of the zone mysteriously cleaner than they should have been. Inconsistent readings. Geometrically precise clean zones inside chaos. Not just cleaned but sterilized. These areas felt wrong, like someone had tried to erase something instead of just radiation. No one claimed responsibility. No photos, no names. Some say these were Soviet Black Ops units testing radiation tech. Others say they weren't Soviet at all. After all, when people move like they're cleaning up secrets, not messes, you have to wonder what they were really removing. And what, exactly, they missed. The Chernobyl syndrome? Psychological. It wasn't the radiation that haunted them. Not really. Not entirely. Survivors from Pripyat and the surrounding villages reported something stranger. Not acute radiation syndrome, but something deeper, slower. Something that crept in beneath the skin without ever lighting up a medical chart. It was grief, yes. Trauma, obviously. But this felt organized. like a psychological organism, breeding in the shadow of the meltdown. They called it Chernobyl syndrome. Not officially. Of course, doctors hated the term. But the evacuees used it like a talisman to name the unnameable. Hallucinations, memory loss, nervous tics, persistent feelings of being watched. Many developed obsessive behaviors, repetitive cleaning rituals, irrational fear of dust, compulsive note-taking. Some dreamt of reactors, others of black rain. One woman in Kiev insisted she could hear static buzzing through her teeth whenever she walked past televisions. Another, a former schoolteacher, began compulsively drawing maps of the exclusion zone from memory, each more detailed than the last, even though she'd only lived in Pripyat for a month. Psychologists tried to explain it as collective trauma, as radiation-induced paranoia, as survivor's guilt manifesting in elaborate neuroses, but none of those labels account for the consistency, or the timing, or why some patients claim they only began to feel sick once they left the zone. Which raises an unnerving question. What if it's not the radiation that gets you but the removal from it? The disappearing villagers. They were the ones no one counted. The ones too far off grid, too stubborn, or too forgotten to make it onto evacuation manifests. Old women in collapsing cottages, beekeepers, hermits, families whose livestock outnumbered their neighbors. In the vast stretch of rural land swallowed by the zone, dozens, maybe hundreds soft villagers simply vanished. Soviet records insist the evacuation was near total, but maps don't breathe, and numbers don't scream. Field reports from liquidators suggest otherwise. Teams sent to clear out certain villages often found them eerily empty, not evacuated, abandoned. Pots still warm, laundry halfway pinned, dogs barking at nothing. In several instances, investigators noted that entire communities seemed to have vanished mid-task, as though erased rather than moved. Some say these villagers fled deeper into the forest, choosing radiation over relocation. Others whisper that military units secured uncooperative settlements off the books. There are even stories of isolated households that returned years later, only to be found changed. Some thriving inexplicably. Others in states of mental deterioration so severe, their speech had regressed to childlike gibberish. There's no proper record, no closure, just unmarked grave mounds and census holes, ghosts made bureaucratic. And the strangest thing? Not a single skeleton has ever been found in those villages. The zone's unseen architecture. There are maps of Chernobyl, of course. Official, clean, reliable maps. But there's something off about them. Something almost too neat, too curated. Visitors have long suspected there are pieces missing. And the more you explore the zone, the more cracks you find in its cartographic reality. Hidden staircases beneath buildings that lead nowhere. Concrete bunkers without entries, ventilation shafts that run deeper than physics should allow. Entire corridors in the reactor complex that never appear on blueprints. Liquidators talk of tunnels wide enough to drive a truck through beneath the forest, beneath Pripyat, beneath the reactor. Theories abound: Cold War command bunkers, backup nuclear storage, secret research labs. One particularly persistent rumor involves an underground rail system designed for rapid Soviet evacuation, abandoned halfway through construction and then quietly unacknowledged. The problem is, some of these structures aren't just hidden, they're sealed, welded shut, forgotten on purpose. And yet, sometimes they're not as empty as they seem. Stalkers report hearing machinery below their feet clicking, humming, ticking. Electrical readings spike near certain concrete slabs. Dogs avoid particular spots. Compasses spin. And beneath it all, the feeling that someone or something still walks the forgotten hallways. What kind of architecture hides from its own creators? The Chernobyl Artifacts. They're scavenged like relics, but they don't belong to any god. Rusted toys, scorched watches, cracked televisions, irradiated dolls with blackened glass eyes. The zone is full of theme-abandoned artifacts clinging to their last identities. Some are inert, others are not, and some change. The so-called Chernobyl Artifacts have become trophies for stalkers and liquidator descendants alike. People dig them up, smuggle them out, sell them online, or just keep them in glass boxes as souvenirs of death. But not all of these objects behave as objects should. There are stories always. Stories of watches ticking backwards, compasses refusing to point north, even small appliances crackling with static despite having no power source. One notorious case involved a cracked porcelain doll recovered from a school desk. Within weeks, the new owner began hearing children's laughter through his radio at night. He didn't own a radio. Some speculate the radiation altered more than atoms, that these objects became emotional sponges, storing pain, panic, final thoughts. Others believe they're just contaminated junk. But then, why do some of them feel warm? And if these artifacts can remember, what else in the zone is quietly watching, waiting to be touched again? The missing reactor core pieces. In theory, the reactor's core was destroyed. In practice, it was scattered violently, unpredictably, chaotically. Tons of uranium fuel rods, graphite blocks, and molten reactor parts were blasted out like apocalyptic shrapnel. Some landed in nearby corridors. Some fused into the infamous elephant's foot. But not everything was found, not even close. Years later, nuclear investigators were still tallying what was missing. Not slightly off, gone. Entire chunks of the core never showed up in post-disaster cleanup. Some may have vaporized. Some sank deep into the concrete substructures. But other strangers still seemed to just vanish without a physical trace. No radiation trail, no thermal signature, just silence. A few liquidators reported odd pockets of high radiation in completely illogical places far from the reactor, sometimes even outside the main complex. Readings that spiked briefly, then dropped to nothing. Others claimed to find black, rock-like substances in the woods, warm to the touch but untraceable on the dosimeter. What do you call a missing piece of the most radioactive object ever made? A loose end or a ticking clock? Either way, the zone is missing some of its heart, and maybe that's why it still feels alive. And if the pieces didn't stay, where did they go? 7 mysteries in, and the zone hasn't blinked. Neither should you. If you're still with us, hit that subscribe button before the next anomaly finds you. And tell me below, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Because the eeriest stories always seem to reach you exactly when they're meant to. The Chernobyl time capsules. Unofficial. Not all who fled did so willingly. And those who left fast. But in those breathless, state-mandated hours of escape, a few made a choice. They buried things. Small things. Personal things. Not for safety, but for memory. And maybe, foolishly, for return. These unofficial time capsules were quietly placed under floorboards, beneath gardens, inside wells, childhood drawings, wedding photos, stashed bottles of vodka. One man reportedly buried a silver harmonica wrapped in his military medals. These weren't acts of survival. They were rituals of defiance. A hope that one day, the past could be reclaimed without glowing in the dark. Years later, stalkers and rogue archaeologists began unearthing them. Some items were heartbreakingly mundane. Others seemed charged emotionally or otherwise. Radiation readings vary wildly. One stash, found behind a brick wall in Pripyat, was sealed in thick lead and contained a sealed, handwritten note, "Open only when the world remembers." But some capsules aren't being found at all. Dogs bark at empty spots in the dirt. Trees grow in strange spirals nearby. And no matter how many metal detectors sweep a field, some belongings refuse to be recovered. Perhaps, in Chernobyl, even memories rot differently. The liquidators' unspoken stories. They were hailed as heroes then, quietly buried in paperwork. The liquidators, the firefighters, soldiers, engineers and miners sent in to clean up the worst nuclear disaster in human history. Some lasted minutes, others months. All of them saw things they never wrote down. Most of them never talked about it at all. Because behind every official report is a different kind of truth, the one that wakes you up screaming. The stories that did surface trickled out years later, whispered in hospital beds or scrawled in notebooks. Accounts of rooms that vibrated with a low hum like breathing. Shadows moving against the grain of light. Men whose radiation badges stayed white when they shouldn't have. Soldiers who refused to return to certain rooftops, though no one could explain why. Then there are the gaps. Whole assignments where no names were listed. Men rotated in, worked for hours and were never seen again. Their logbooks lost, their dosimeters malfunctioning. One rumor tells of a decontamination team that simply walked into the reactor basement and never walked out. No collapse, no meltdown, just silence. And yet, when you ask the veterans about it, they just stare at the floor and say, "We did what we had to do." But what exactly was it they had to do? The Chernobyl stalkers' motivations. They don't go for money, they don't go for fame, and most of them don't even go for YouTube. The so-called stalkers of the exclusion zone, those who sneak in illegally, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, usually without protection air after something more elusive and far more dangerous. Some say it's the thrill, the rush of standing where no one else dares. Others insist it's a form of morning tourism, but the truth is always more complicated. Many stalkers return again and again, not because they love the danger, but because they feel something pulling them back, as if the zone becomes a kind of spiritual lodestone. One man described it as the only place that feels real anymore. Psychologists call it trauma reenactment. Philosophers call it pilgrimage. But inside the zone, those terms stop mattering. What matters is the silence, the isolation, the haunting sense that the end of the world has already happened and you're walking through its museum. Some bring offerings, some talk to the dogs, some speak to the buildings. One woman, a former oncology nurse, left a pair of baby shoes beneath the Ferris wheel every time she returned. She wouldn't say why, only that she had to. But maybe what stalkers are chasing isn't adrenaline its answers, or absolution, or something far more radioactive. The zone's unexplained energy signatures. Geiger counters tell one story, EMF meters tell another, and then there's the third story, the one your electronics try to hide. Over the years, multiple visitors and researchers have reported sudden spikes in electromagnetic energy at specific locations in the zone readings, too high for background noise, but not connected to any known power source. Places where phones glitch, cameras refuse to record, compass needles do pirouettes. One infamous zone is an abandoned Pripyat kindergarten, where several devices reportedly powered on despite drained batteries. A drone pilot once lost control of his craft midair, only for it to land safely on its own in front of Reactor 4. He never flew again. It's not just equipment, people feel it too. Sudden dizziness, static crawling across the skin, a high-pitched tone, like a tinnitus note you didn't know you had. Some describe it as pressure behind the eyes. Others say it feels like standing too close to an old television set. Some pass out. Others just cry. Skeptics blame residual static, magnetic anomalies, or psychological suggestion. But these signatures show up in patterns, always in the same places, always behaving like something is there, pulsing just beneath the surface. And if it's not electricity, what kind of energy is trying to reach through? The radioactive trees, Postfire. They looked like ordinary trees, until they caught fire. In the years following the Chernobyl explosion, The red forest became the stuff of horror story as landscape so saturated with radiation that it glowed metaphorically and occasionally, literally. But it wasn't until the wildfires began that people truly understood what had been buried in the bark. When trees burn, they release their memory. In most forests, that memory is carbon and ash. But in Chernobyl, it's strontium-90, cesium-137, and a dozen other radioactive isotopes. The fires that tore through the exclusion zone didn't just ignite the landscape, they resurrected its contamination. What puzzled scientists was how much radiation came back. Trees that had tested clean on the surface belched plumes of radioactive smoke. The bark, the sap, the leaves, they had stored it all like some botanical time bomb. One tree, upon being felled, triggered radiation alarms from 20 feet away. No one could explain it. The roots hadn't been in a hot zone. There was no record of fallout, and yet it glowed. And then came the black trees, ones that never burned, but stood scorched and silent, their growth rings warped, their DNA unreadable. What else do these trees remember that we've forgotten? The Chernobyl cults. They don't advertise, they don't recruit. But every so often, a hiker in the exclusion zone stumbles across a campfire still warm or hears chanting echoing through a rusted-out apartment block in Pripyat. These aren't squatters. They're something older, stranger, and disturbingly organized. The whispered label, Chernobyl cults. Some wear protective gear. Others, bafflingly, do not. Their symbols painted onto buildings, carved into trees blend orthodox iconography with nuclear hazard signs. One motif appears again and again, a burning eye surrounded by children's hands. The groups are small, but their presence is undeniable. Abandoned food caches, worn prayer mats, handwritten scriptures found on the backs of evacuation notices. What they believe varies, depending on who's asked. One theory holds they worship the zone itself as a living, purifying Goda divine force born of fire and decay. Another suggests they believe the radiation is cleansing, a sacrament that purifies the faithful. A few stalkers even claim to have spoken with members who believe Pripyat is a gate to a higher state of consciousness zone that can only be reached through prolonged exposure. None of this is officially documented, but every so often, a drone picks up figures in robes disappearing into the woods. And sometimes they look back. The Duga radar's true purpose. It loomed like a skeletal god, 150 meters tall and nearly a kilometer long, hidden in the forest like a rusting lie. Officially, it was a Soviet over-the-horizon radar system. Unofficially, it was a factory for conspiracy theories. The Duga radar, also called the Russian woodpecker, for the incessant tapping sound it emitted, was built to detect missile launches, or so they say. But why build such a monolith just a few kilometers from a nuclear power plant? Why surround it with fences, bunkers, and enough paranoia to rival Area 51? Some suspect the Duga was never about missiles at all, that it was a psychological warfare tool pumping subliminal signals across the globe, that the clicking wasn't a glitch, but a coded broadcast. Others point to classified research into weather manipulation, earthquake induction, or even mass population control via EM fields. The strangest theory? That Duga wasn't looking outward but inward, toward something beneath the earth, toward the reactor, or what was under the reactor. After the disaster, the signal stopped. Dead silence. Like a voice that had said what it needed to say. And yet, in 2020, someone picked up a faint tapping, just once, just enough. Whatever Duga was listening for, it might still be speaking. The zone's unmapped waterways. On official maps, the rivers are where they should be. The Pripyat flows, the cooling ponds stagnate, and the reservoirs sit like forgotten veins in the body of the zone. But on the ground, in the overgrowth, things get stranger. The zone breathes differently now, and water doesn't follow rules anymore. Stalkers have documented hidden streams trickling through apartment basements, entire ponds with no visible inlet or outlet, underground flows that gurgle with a heat not caused by the sun. One group discovered a narrow canal that wasn't there the week before, cut cleanly through a concrete path like a scalpel wound. And then there are the disappearing pools, bodies of water that show up on satellite for a week, then vanish. Radiation levels near these sites spike and plummet unpredictably. Some of the most lethal hotspots aren't near reactors, they're near puddles. One had a surface temperature of 17 degrees Celsius, but was boiling 30 centimeters down. Geologists speculate about groundwater shifts, erosion, and buried waste migration, but others fear the zone is developing its own circulatory systemone that spreads not water, but memory, contamination, decay. When rivers move without permission, what else in the zone has started thinking for itself? The Chernobyl mines, they were supposed to be a last resort. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, Soviet authorities feared the molten reactor core would burn through the containment structure and into the water table, triggering a second, possibly nuclear, explosion. So they sent miners young, strong, mostly unwilling beneath Reactor 4 to dig a tunnel, a preventative grave for a lava-like nightmare. What's often omitted in official accounts is what else the miners found down there. Several teams returned pale and quiet. Some refused to speak at all. There are vague references in classified documents to encountering resistance, not mechanical, not geological. And then, after weeks of grueling labor, something changed. Suddenly, the tunneling stopped. Equipment was left underground. Blueprints were scrubbed. No closure. Just a sealed-off shaft and silence. Later, rumors emerged of booby-trap sexplosives left behind by Cold War-era troops to protect sensitive infrastructure. But others speak of something stranger. Unmarked chambers, strange symbols scrawled into the concrete, echoes of voices in sections where no one was working. And then there's the unexplained radiation spikes in those tunnels, years after they were closed. If the core didn't reach them, what did? Because sometimes a tunnel isn't an escape route. Sometimes it's a lock. The sarcophagus's structural integrity. They called it the sarcophagus, as if the reactor were a corpse being respectfully entombed. But what they built wasn't a monument. It was desperation made concrete. The original containment structure, thrown over the remains of Reactor 4, was built in haste, in radiation, and under the kind of pressure that bends steel and ethics. And from the moment it was completed, it began to fail. Cracks appeared within months. Water pooled in corners it shouldn't reach. Radiation escaped in whispers, then in gusts. Metal warped. The support beams began to corrode, some dissolving faster than physics predicted. Engineers monitoring the structure reported strange shift temperature fluctuations inside sealed chambers, humidity spikes with no weather correlation, and instruments going blind in one corner of the sarcophagus, as if the space itself was rejecting observation. But the deeper mystery isn't just what the sarcophagus hides, it's what it does. Some theorize that the intense radiation, combined with the trapped heat and decaying metal, may have triggered unknown chemical reactions. Or perhaps, the materials inside have begun to change on their own, beyond our models of decay. The new safe confinement now covers the old one like a second coffin. But what happens when the corpse underneath is still moving? The Chernobyl healers. Among the evacuees, there were a few anomalies. Individuals who should have been sick, who were expected to die, who didn't. Not only did they survive, but some of them seemed enhanced, faster healing. Stronger immune systems, absurd resistance to disease, and the most unsettling part? A few claimed it wasn't accidental. They called themselves healers, though not all agreed on what that meant. One elderly woman, displaced from a village near the reactor, began treating neighbors for everything from migraines to infections, using only herbs and her hands. Locals swore by her. So did the plants. She grew food in contaminated soil, yet her crops tested cleaner than anything in Kyiv markets. Another man, a former technician exposed during the explosion, reportedly recovered from third-degree burns with almost no scarring. When interviewed, he claimed the radiation had shown him something, and now he could redirect energy. He died mysteriously 2 years later, his body displaying no decomposition. Were these mutations, coincidences, psychosomatic phenomena, or was the radiation less of a curse and more of a teacher, bestowing something unexpected on those who stayed behind? If some people leave the zone broken, why do others leave changed? The zone's phantom roads. They exist on maps that haven't been updated in decades thin. Dusty lines that wind through dense woodland and vanish into swamp. Roads that, once, connected tiny villages and industrial sites. Now, some of them are gone. Not just overgrown gone, and yet people still find them. Or rather, they find something. Stalkers have reported stumbling onto narrow paths that don't appear on satellite imagery. Old asphalt cracked but strangely clean, flanked by rusting road signs in dialects no longer in use. The strangest part? These roads often lead nowhere. They bend back into themselves, loop around hills that didn't exist on the way in, or vanish beneath unbroken forest as if swallowed. Some theorize these are simply old Soviet military service routes covered up, forgotten, reclaimed by nature. Others believe they're psychological echoes, appearing only to those in certain mental states. One stalker claimed he followed a road that led directly to the middle of Pripyat from the wrong side. The forest behind him? Gone. Only buildings ahead. One team marked a phantom road with red flags on their way in. On the return, the flags were Thearcophagus to trees, 30 feet above their original height. Where do these roads go when no one follows? The Chernobyl Graffiti. In a place sealed off from life, the writing on the walls is louder than ever. Chernobyl is covered in graffiti layers of it, some from before the accident, some from after. Most of it is simple. Names, dates, warnings. But among the chaos of spray paint and soot, there are pieces that don't belong. Graffiti no one remembers seeing appear. Murals that appear too detailed to be made quickly, too specific to be random. One of the most famous depicts a child in a gas mask holding a sunflower. It appears in at least 3 locations, miles apart, identical down to the last brushstroke. No artist has ever taken credit. Another, a figure outlined in chalk, kneeling before the sarcophagus, haloed in the radioactive warning symbol, fresh, untouched by rain. More disturbing are the symbols. Spiral motifs repeating through apartment blocks, cryptic phrases in Slavic dialects that linguists can't place. One phrase, scrawled dozens of times across various locations. He waits in the silence. Is it art? A collective hallucination? A form of protest? Or is the zone itself creating messages, like a haunted chalkboard scribbling in its own ruin? When Graffiti writes back, who's holding the can? The unexplained power surges before the accident. The Chernobyl explosion was officially blamed on a failed safety test, but anomalies appeared before that fateful night tones that still make electrical engineers shudder. Unexplained power surges, flickering lights, instruments that read impossible outputs. These weren't bugs in the system, they were warnings, but no one listened. 2 weeks prior, operators logged a voltage spike that briefly overloaded the control systems, then vanished without trace. No cause, no damage, just a pulse. In the hours before the meltdown, the surges increased. Lights flickered in corridors far from the reactor. Backup systems came online for no reason, then shut down. A technician reportedly saw the temperature gauge register a negative value in a sealed, pressurized loop. Some blamed it on aging Soviet tech. Others believed it was sabotage, though no evidence ever surfaced. A few survivors insist they saw flashes of blue light in the turbine hall before the explosion. Not lightning. Not arc flashes. Something else. Whatever it was, it seemed to anticipate the failure. As if something within the reactor was waking up, or warning them. And if the power surges were symptoms, then what was the disease? The Chernobyl relics trade. It's the black market's dirtiest secret, literally. Trinkets pulled from the zone, glowing souvenirs smuggled past rusting fences and clueless guards. Gas masks, military badges, melted alarm clocks, pieces of playground equipment all laced with radiation, history, and the kind of sadness that never fully rubs off. And yet, there's a steady demand. The trade in Chernobyl relics operates in the shadow of legality, often passed off as harmless Cold War kitsch. But some of these objects still tick on dosimeters. More than a few buyers have fallen mysteriously ill, though the cause is always disputed. One collector in Poland reportedly kept a Pripyat road sign above his desk. Months later, his skin began to flake. His hair came out in clumps. When tested, the sign was clean, or so the lab said. The question isn't just who's buying, but why. For some, it's a fetish for apocalypse. For others, it's a talisman against mortality, a way to own a piece of the world's most infamous mistake. But deeper in the underworld, there are whispers of collectors who seek specific items, things that were close to the core, or to certain people, relics that might carry more than radiation, because not all contamination shows up on a scanner. The zone's unseen flora adaptations. To the naked eye, the plants in the zone look normal. Grass still grows, trees still stretch. Moss creeps across derelict playgrounds like any other forgotten town. But under a microscope, things are stranger. Much stranger. Researchers studying Chernobyl flora have found subtle anomaly cell walls thickened far beyond normal limits, chloroplasts operating under degraded light, and DNA chains with redundancies never before seen in that species. Some plants in the red forest seem to absorb radiation, using it somehow. One moss sample reportedly grew faster in high radiation conditions than in a sterile lab. The real puzzle isn't just how they survive, but how they adapt. Certain ferns develop metallic hues under duress. Some vines grow toward radioactive hotspots like sunflowers to sunlight. There's a recurring theory among biologists that these changes aren't defensive. They're opportunistic. Evolution in hyperdrive. Then there are the rumors. Flowers that bloom in darkness, trees that resist decomposition, entire patches of forest that echo with silences if the plants themselves suppress sound. Nature, it seems, isn't just recovering. It's rewriting itself, quietly, patiently. And in a few more decades, we may not recognize what's growing there at all. The Chernobyl escape routes. The official evacuation was broadcast like a ritual, orderly, mandatory, state-approved. But in the panic of the 26th of April and the days that followed, not everyone waited for permission. Some fled on foot, others by bike, even horseback. A few bribed their way out on contaminated trucks. And then there are the escape routes that don't appear on any map. Underground service tunnels, supposedly sealed since the 70s, were found pried open from the inside. Abandoned railways, overgrown and forgotten, bore signs of recent use-abent foliage, tire imprints, cigarette butts. A former reactor guard claimed he saw a family of 5 cross the Pripyat River on a raft made of refrigerator doors. No one believed him. Then there were the disappearances. People whose names never showed up on evacuation lists, whose apartments remained untouched, meals half-eaten on the table, no witnesses, no graves. Just absence. A few months later, a handwritten letter postmarked from Romania arrived at a Kyiv address. "We are alive. We cannot come back. Tell no one." Were these escapees saved by instinct or cursed by proximity? And did they ever truly leave the zone? Because the strangest routes out might just lead back in. The zone's silent witnesses. They're everywhere, forgotten things, left exactly where panic dropped them. A child's red shoe on a school staircase. A wedding album open to a smiling couple whose names have been lost. Prescription bottles still sitting in kitchen cabinets. Letters never mailed. Meals never eaten. Lives never resumed. These aren't just objects, they're evidence of lives frozen mid-breath, of decisions that never got to be made. Some researchers call them silent witnesses, not because they record, but because they accuse. They point fingers at the hurried bureaucracy that told everyone it would only be a few days. They haunt the rational mind because they are irrational remnants. No one would pack for a weekend and leave behind their only photograph of a dead relative. No one evacuates a home forever and forgets the keys on the table. And yet, there they are. Liquidators noted strange emotional responses to these items. Sudden dizziness, hallucinations, tears without context. One man touched a teddy bear and later swore he heard a child's voice whispering, "Stay." Another woman opened a diary, only to find the last entry read, "It's too late now." The ink was still legible. In a place where no one speaks, the objects do, and they never stop. The Chernobyl Doomsday preppers. For some, the disaster wasn't the end, it was confirmation. A signal that the world had ended, just not for everyone yet. The Chernobyl catastrophe became a kind of dark baptism for doomsday preppers across the Soviet Union and beyond. Not the ones with bunkers and tinned peaches, but the quiet ones. The ones who took to the woods, the salt mines, the crumbling Orthodox churches and never came back. The zone drew them. A few came to scavenge. Some came to learn, but others came to wait. For what? They wouldn't say. Years after the meltdown, stalkers reported isolated homesteads deep within the exclusion, zonefully stocked, meticulously organized, and clearly inhabited. But no one was ever found inside. One shack had hundreds of iodine tablets stacked neatly by expiration date. Another was filled wall to wall with empty water jugs, each labeled with coordinates and the date it was sealed. A map recovered from a makeshift underground shelter had red X's plotted in a spiral, all centering on Reactor 4. The spiral extended into the future decades ahead. The last mark was labeled Awakening. Who were they preparing for? And more unnervingly, what were they preparing us for? The Unidentified Objects, Chernobyl incident. You won't find it in the official reports. But if you sift through enough testimony, especially the ones they tried to bury, patterns emerge. On the night of the 26th of April, multiple witnesses, from power plant workers to nearby military personnel, described something strange in the sky. Lights, shapes, orbs hovering near the reactor before, during, and after the explosion. One technician swore he saw a dull orange sphere hanging motionless above the plant, mere seconds before the blast. A firefighter claimed a beam of light struck the core moments before ignition. Others reported moving stars zigzagging against the night sky with a precision no aircraft could match. Military logs later redacted mention radar anomalies. Civilian cameras captured nothing, but several film rolls were mysteriously overexposingly on the frames taken that night. Theories range from Soviet surveillance drones to hallucinations caused by stress and radiation. But then why do similar accounts surface in places as far as Belarus, where fallout hadn't yet reached? And why did the sightings stop as abruptly as they began? Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was something watching, something already here, not sent to prevent the disaster but to witness it. And perhaps to ensure it happened. The Chernobyl psychics. The official narrative leaves no room for prophecy. Yet, in the months and years surrounding the Chernobyl disaster, a strange pattern emerged: people who claimed they had seen it coming. Dreams, visions. warnings scribbled in journals or shouted in public squares, some dismissed as delusional, others quietly recorded by KGB agents with uncomfortable diligence. One woman in Leningrad allegedly mailed a letter to the Ministry of Energy on the 20th of April, 1986. It read, "The fire comes from beneath. You built it over a mouth. Don't test it." No reply. The letter was never officially acknowledged, but a carbon copy turned up in a private archive decades later. Another Manon unlicensed healer from Gomel spent the year before the explosion carving nuclear symbols into tree bark and repeating the phrase, "The black water will come." He disappeared in May. No one saw him leave. After the explosion, the reports multiplied. Individuals began claiming new abilities, precognitive dreams, electromagnetic sensitivity, even healing powers. Some were charlatans. Others weren't so easy to explain. One child, relocated to Kiev, drew detailed maps of Pripyat she had never seen. Were these fragments of coincidence? Or did the zone awaken something in the minds of those closest to it? And if so, what else is waiting to be activated? The zone's living fossils. Deep in the swamps and thickets of the exclusion zone, where humans no longer tread, and even the liquidators gave up charting, something ancient may have survived. Reports began surfacing of flora and fauna that resembled prehistoric species plants with leaf structures thought extinct, insects that resemble fossil records more than modern taxonomy. One group of researchers claimed to find a moss variety genetically similar to a species believed to have vanished 400 million years ago. A forest ranger reported spotting a species of fish with armored plating and translucent flesh. It darted away before he could document it, but he refused to return to the site alone. Of course, these stories are dismissed by mainstream science as misidentification, radiation-induced mutations, or simply fabrications. But the consistency of the reports and the isolation of the zone's most contaminated pockets make it plausible that evolution has rewound or accelerated in bizarre and unpredictable ways. Could radiation have unlocked genetic throwbacks buried deep within DNA? Or perhaps the zone is becoming a crucible where ancient survival traits rise again not as anomalies, but as adaptations. In Chernobyl, extinction may not be permanent. And what if some species were never entirely gone to begin with? The Chernobyl ghost villages. Scattered throughout the exclusion zone are entire settlements that seem immune to Timeno in the romantic, preserved sense, but in a more unsettling way. Villages where the air feels thick, where moss climbs the walls in symmetrical patterns, and where every house seems frozen at the exact same moment of abandonment. They are the ghost villages. Walk through one and you'll notice. Plates still on tables, beds neatly made, radios left tuned to stations that no longer exist, and silence and not the rural quiet of nature, but the oppressive absence of sound, as if noise itself has been forbidden. Animals avoid these areas, so do most humans. Some liquidators reported bizarre experiences in such places. Watches stopped, batteries drained. One soldier claimed he saw a man standing in a window, unmoving, hours apart. When he approached, the house was empty but warm. A folkloric layer has built up over time. Locals say these villages weren't just evacuated, but swallowed. That time folds in on itself here. One stalker left a Polaroid in a kitchen. When he returned months later, the picture was still there, but it now showed him standing in the room. Maybe the people never left. Maybe they're just not on our side of the glass. The missing radiation data. There's a gap in the numbers. A silence where data should be screaming. In the days immediately following the explosion at Reactor 4, radiation readings were taken on paper, on film, on Geiger counters that clicked like hailstorms. But later, when analysts tried to reconstruct the timeline, whole swaths of data were gone. Not just unrecorded, erased, edited, sanitized. Some of this was Soviet protocol, censorship masquerading as damage control, but certain inconsistencies are harder to explain. Field reports mentioned dosimeters maxing out in areas that were later listed as moderately safe. Blood samples taken from first responders showed isotope concentrations that don't match official exposure levels. And then there are the blacked-out logs files stamped with classification seals that technically shouldn't exist for nuclear accident records. Why the cover-up? It wasn't just fear of international embarrassment. Some researchers now believe there were radiation signatures inconsistent with uranium or graphite-based fallout. Isotopes that shouldn't have been present. Patterns of contamination that imply additional unacknowledged sources of release. A reactor explodes, and the data disappears. Or maybe it never made it out of the zone. Because when you bury the numbers, you're not just hiding the truth, you're protecting something. Or someone. The Chernobyl genetic memory. Trauma echoes. Sometimes it doesn't stop. Decades after the disaster, children born to Chernobyl survivors began to exhibit unusual symptoms, not medical conditions. Exactly. But memories of places they'd never seen. Sounds they couldn't explain. Dreams filled with ash, alarms, red skies, and distant sirens. Doctors blamed secondhand stress, absorbed through parental grief. But the accounts were too specific. One boy in Lithuania described the smell of the red forest after rainfall. A girl in Minsk spoke of graphite smoke and the sound of metal warping under heat, details she could not have known. None of them had visited the zone. Scientists have flirted with the concept of epigenetics, environmental trauma altering gene expression in ways that subtly shape future generations. But what's happening here goes beyond biology. It's like something informational is being passed down, not just chemically, but narratively. Memories encoded in blood. Some believe this is nature's way of forcing remembrance. Others believe the zone itself has imprinted on the human species like a radioactive scar in our collective unconscious. And if that's true, then we're all still inside it, carrying pieces of Chernobyl in our sleep. Which begs the question, can you inherit a disaster like a surname? The zone's anomalous weather, cloudless sky, sudden rain, still air, followed by localized gusts that slam doors and rattle the bones of collapsed buildings. The exclusion zone has weather, but it doesn't always play by the same rules as the rest of Ukraine. Visitors report abrupt temperature shifts, drops of 10, sometimes 15 degrees within seconds. Microbursts of fog in isolated alleys, snow that falls only over the sarcophagus, nowhere else. One team of researchers reported a lightning strike that hit the same patch of ground 5 times in 3 minutes. No storm clouds, no sound, just blue light and static. Meteorologists tried to explain it away. They blamed soil composition, uneven terrain, or electromagnetic interference, but no model fully accounts for the strangeness. A particularly chilling phenomenon occurs near certain abandoned housing blocks. A low-pressure pocket that builds every afternoon around 3 p.m. Animals avoid it. Cameras fog. People feel watched. Then there's the red forest, where the air sometimes sparkles not visibly, but audibly. A high-pitched shimmer, like wind chimes underwater. It doesn't happen often. But when it does, even the dogs grow silent. Weather is supposed to be chaotic, but this feels deliberate, like something inside the zone is breathing and dreaming in clouds. If the first 33 didn't shake your grip on reality, don't worry, we're just scratching the irradiated surface. Tap subscribe if you haven't already. This channel is where the unexplained doesn't get explained. And I'm still curious. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now? Because some places and some hours seem to attract these stories like moths to a fallout flame. The Chernobyl urban legends. Most disasters die in silence. Chernobyl spawned folklore. The exclusion zone is not just a place, it's a myth factory. Its landscapes have been reshaped by radiation and rumor in equal measure. Urban legends grow there like mold, thick and inescapable. Stories passed between liquidators, whispered among stalkers, murmured in low voices over campfires, surrounded by concrete ghosts. There's the tale of the Ash Bride, a woman in a wedding dress seen wandering near Reactor 4, her face featureless and gray, who vanishes if you follow. There's the legend of the Red Room, a basement beneath the Pripyat hospital where medical tools move on their own, and where some say the dead try to finish their final shift. And there's the third shift phantom workers seen in windows after nightfall, still doing their jobs decades after the evacuation. Of course, none of this is official. But the zone has a way of rearranging people's certainty. The stories persist because they feel truer than the facts. Radiation may deform bodies, but the zone twists stories until they grow roots. And if enough people believe a ghost walks Pripyat's streets, at what point does it become real? Or worse, what if it always was? The unexplained animal migration patterns. Nature abhors a vacuum, but in Chernobyl, nature restructured it. Within a few years of the disaster, wildlife began returning to the exclusion zone in unusual numbers and stranger still, in stranger routes. Wolves, boars, elk, lynx. Entire populations not just surviving, but migrating into the zone, as if drawn by something. Some routes contradicted decades of established patterns. Migratory birds nesting in radioactive trees. Insects thriving in hotspots. Packs of animals moving in coordinated loops that make no ecological sense. Scientists chalked it up to the absence of humans. Less hunting, fewer roads. But migration doesn't just change because of vacancy. It changes because of signal. And something in the zone is sending one. Biologists have found oddly synchronized behaviors: wolves refusing to cross invisible lines, birds flocking in perfect circles over reactor-adjacent swamps, deer moving toward rather than away from contaminated zones. One team tagged a fox, only to watch its path form a spiral across the northern quadrant, an almost mathematical spiral before the GPS feed abruptly went dead. No carcass was found. It's almost as if the zone is learning to shape its own ecology, not just passively absorbing wildlife but organizing it, recruiting it. What if the food chain is no longer in our favor? The Chernobyl time travelers. It started as a joke, internet threads and fringe forums mostly. Grainy photos of Pripyat with impossible timestamps. Posts from accounts claiming to be from the future, who always knew too much about the meltdown. A woman in Kharkiv once claimed her father was a scientist who left for a job in 1983 and returned with burns that matched 1986 reports. He was never officially employed by the power station. But then, the stories got stranger. One man entered the zone in 2011 and emerged 36 hours later insisting it was still 1986. His watch had stopped. His dosimeter was blank. His speech, erratic. He died 2 weeks later of rapid organ failure. Autopsy reports were inconclusive. His camera, when developed, showed a photo of Reactor 4 intactors before the explosion. Even more bizarre, there are whispers of individuals appearing in old Chernobyl photos, wearing clothing decades out of sync. Blurry, indistinct, but undeniably wrong. Time travel? Probably not. But time here is porous, dislocated, folding in ways that normal geography does not allow. And in a place built on denial, erasure, and catastrophe, maybe time itself learned to rupture. Because if time doesn't behave in the zone, what else has stopped obeying the rules? The zone's silent radiation. There's no sound to it, no smell, no taste. It doesn't glow. It doesn't hiss. The most dangerous force in Chernobyl does what death rarely does. It waits quietly. You won't know you've been touched until the cells start folding in on themselves. But even beyond the physics, the silence is more than sensory. It's psychological. Radiation here feels personal. In some parts of the zone, Your dosimeter clicks in warning like a nervous heartbeat. In others, it doesn't click at 11 when you know the danger is there. The readings fluctuate in ways that defy consistency. Whole sections seem to pulse with presence, and yet give off no measurable danger until hours later, when the nausea begins. Stalkers speak of cold zones, places where you feel fine, perfectly safe, but your compass won't stabilize, and time seems to lag. No heat, no sound. Just a pressure behind the eyes, a tightness in the chest, a deep animal urge to back away. Not fear. Recognition. As if something's looking back. The great lie of radiation is that it's invisible. But in the zone, it's not just unseen. It's aware, patient, selective. And maybe silence isn't the absence of danger, maybe it is the danger. The Chernobyl secret meetings. Officially, the Soviet response to Chernobyl was slow, clumsy, and tragically bureaucratic. But underneath the chaos was something colder, deliberate, hidden. There were meetings that no one talks about. Not the emergency committees or Politburo sessions, but darker ones, convened in bunkers, behind closed doors, with no transcripts and no names. Witnesses recall black cars arriving at the power plant within hours of the explosion, before the government acknowledged the event publicly. A helicopter landed on a private strip near the Duga radar just past midnight. No manifest, no insignias, guards who later disappeared from records. A KGB memo never officially published refers to an internal assessment team assembled prior to May Day, tasked not with containment, but with observation and silence. Rumors suggest some of the scientists brought in weren't nuclear experts, but psychologists, signal intelligence officers, and geologists with classified clearances. One liquidator claimed he overheard a conversation in which someone asked not how to fix Reactor 4, but how to confirm its behavior. What were they meeting about? What did they know already? And if they were discussing consequences before they admitted the cause, then who knew what and when? And worse still, why didn't they stop it? The zone's bioluminescent fungi. It wasn't part of any plan. Just a few researchers on a night hike testing soil samples near the red forest. That's when they saw it glowing faintly beneath the fallen leaves. Not a trick of the light, not reflection. A dull green shimmer, breathing in slow pulses from what looked like moss or fungus. Bioluminescence isn't unknown in nature, but this wasn't marine life. This was landlocked, radiation-soaked, and according to the tests composed of mycelium strains that don't exist anywhere else. The glow persisted in darkness, fluctuating with exposure to electromagnetic fields. One sample, when moved near a live Geiger counter, pulsed faster as if reacting, communicating. What's more unsettling, the locations of these fungi. Found near hotspots, near water runoff channels, near places with inconsistent radiation patterns. They seem to form networks underground winding through soil like veins. Some believe they're absorbing radiation, others think they're moving it. And if they're capable of reacting to stimuli, what else are they doing? Growing, watching. Fungi are nature's recyclers. They break down the dead. But here, they may be feeding on something stranger. Maybe even evolving with it. And maybe the zone isn't decomposing anymore. Maybe it's incubating. The Chernobyl echoes. Sound behaves differently in the zone. It's subtle at first, just a wrongness, a dissonance in the air. A footstep that seems to arrive before your boot hits the ground. A whistle of wind that doesn't match the trees. Then it escalates. You call to a friend, and your voice comes back a second too late, from the wrong direction. You drop a stone into a stairwell and hear the echo. Not once, but twice. The second time, it's softer or closer. These are the Chernobyl echoes. Not metaphors real, recorded audio anomalies. Liquidators reported hearing phantom footsteps in corridors that were empty. Researchers logged unexplained vibrations in sealed chambers, as if something behind the walls was answering. Tourists describe eerie chorus-like hums emanating from intact apartment blocks at dusk, long after the air should have gone still. One building in Pripyat was dubbed the Voice Box by stalkers. Inside, you hear breathing that isn't yours, always just behind you. Audio engineers tried to study the phenomenon, but abandoned the project after one of their tapes played back sounds that weren't recorded: laughter, crackling static, and a distant warning siren. Maybe the buildings are speaking, or maybe they're just remembering. But war, what do echoes wait for? The missing Pripyat residents. Pripyat had a population of nearly 50,000 before the evacuation. Today, that number is clear in memory, but murky in evidence. Hundreds were relocated, tracked, monitored, and yet, a small percentage simply vanished. No evacuation records, no refugee status, no death certificates, nothing. Most of them lived in the outer blocks near the woods, closer to the Duga radar. Entire family units never registered in their new assigned towns. No school enrollments, no work logs. Just names that stop appearing after the 26th of April, 1986. Some say they fled illegally into Belarus or deeper into Ukraine. Others think they perished and were quietly disposed of to minimize scandal. But there are stranger theories. One liquidator found a cellar in an abandoned Pripyat building filled with food, clothes, and children's toys fresh, as if someone had stayed for weeks after the evacuation. But no footprints, no bodies, no explanation. A diary found in a stairwell detailed plans to hide until the lights stop. The final entry reads, "The clocks don't match anymore. I think we missed something." No one knows what that means, but the idea lingers. Some residents didn't leave because they didn't need to. Or worse, they were never meant to. The Chernobyl water bears, tardigrades. Tardigrades, microscopic organisms nicknamed water bears, are famous for surviving extremes: boiling, freezing, vacuum, and radiation. Naturally, researchers turned to them during post-Chernobyl studies. What they found was expected: resilience. What they didn't expect was adaptation. Specimens recovered from soil near Reactor 4 exhibited not just survival, but transformation. They weren't just enduring radiation, they seemed to be incorporating it. Cell walls thickened, reproductive cycles accelerated, and more disturbingly, their DNA developed fragments never seen in other populations. These weren't mutations. They were structured changes, as if the radiation had rewritten their genetic code with intent. One particularly bizarre observation: a strain of Chernobyl tardigrades formed colonies. Normally solitary, these samples grouped together into clusters that moved in unison, responding to stimuli collectively. Light, heat, vibrations, almost like neurons firing. It led to unsettling questions. Can radiation become a selective pressure for intelligence? Is adaptation in such organisms merely survival, the beginning of a new form of cognition? They are microscopic, harmless, for now. But evolution doesn't care about scale, and the smallest survivors may one day become the dominant memory of this place. Because in the ruins of human failure, something else is learning how to live. The zone's unusual plant colors. You see it first in the periphery with a violet sheen, leaves with a metallic tint, grass that turns black not in death but in growth. These are not autumn hues or withering artifacts. These are living things, photosynthesizing, thriving, and yet painted in pigments that shouldn't exist in nature. The zone's flora has taken on a palette from another world. At first, scientists assumed it was simply chlorosis or pigment degradation due to radiation. But many of these plants don't show typical signs of stress. They grow quickly, uniformly, in shapes and shades that suggest something new is being expressed on a cellular level. Some exhibit iridescence. Others reflect infrared light, as if they're adapting to radiation as a form of energy. One researcher noted a patch of moss that appeared copper under moonlight and green under sunlight-shifting spectrums as if choosing camouflage. Another described tree bark that developed a deep indigo under persistent cloud cover, reverting when exposed to heat. But the deeper mystery isn't how they change, it's why. What are these plants trying to signal, if anything at all? A warning? A mutation? Or an invitation? Because when color becomes unnatural, maybe the plants are no longer just adapting. Maybe they're communicating. The Chernobyl dog whisperers. The dogs of Chernobyl are legendary descendants of pets left behind, feral yet eerily social, roaming the ruins like ghosts in fur. Most avoid humans, some follow them at a distance. But a select few people seem able to approach them without fear, without bark or bite. They feed them, sit beside them, speak to them. The dogs listen. These people are known unofficially as dog whisperers. Not professionals, not animal behaviorists, just individuals with a strange affinity, often evacuees or stalkers who return regularly. One man, a former janitor from Pripyat, is said to have formed a pack of over 20. They sleep near his campsite, patrol with him. He never leashes them. He speaks to them softly, as if reminding them of something. It's not just obedience, it's recognition. The dogs seem to remember, follow paths no longer marked, sit in front of buildings that collapsed years ago. Some visitors report seeing dogs congregate in front of Reactor 4 at sunset, in total silence, as if waiting. Why do these animals trust certain people? And how do those people know which dogs will follow? Perhaps memory is more than human. Perhaps loyalty survives disaster. Or maybe something inside the zone is choosing its messengers. The zone's silent sirens. They never sounded. Not when they were supposed to. Not when the reactor blew, or when the radiation plume crept over rooftops. The sirens mounted on buildings, poles, and towers remained dormant as the disaster unfolded mechanical lungs that held their breath. And now, decades later, they remain. Still bolted into the skeletons of buildings, still intact in their rusting casings. Visitors call them the silent sirens, symbols of failure and false security. But something about them unsettles more than it should. Some say they emit a low hum at night, barely audible, like metal remembering its purpose. Others have reported hearing a single, sharp burst in the distance one blare, then nothing. No power, no trigger. One liquidator said he saw a siren light flicker on briefly, red and spinning, even though the pole had no connected wiring. His dosimeter spiked at the same moment. A tourist captured footage of a siren slowly rotating, no sound, just movement, creaking like a joint waking up from sleep. What if the sirens didn't fail? What if they were stopped? Or worse, what if they're saving their scream for something still to come? Because when the voice of warning stays quiet, maybe it's not silence. Maybe it's suspense. The Chernobyl reindeer. No one expected them to return. Yet not long after the disaster, they began to appear in the northwestern stretches of the exclusion zone. Reindeer, or something that closely resembled them. Sleek, quiet, mismatched antlers, herds moving in formation with a discipline that unnerved even seasoned biologists. They were not tagged, not previously observed in the area, and their behavior didn't fit. One stalker followed a small herd for 2 days. He noted their synchronized movements, the odd silencino calls, no stomps, no sounds of breath. One reindeer turned to look at him, and he said it was like staring into a mirror that refused to reflect you back. Others claimed to see reindeer lying in the contaminated snow for hours, unmoving, as if recharging. Some show signs of adaptation, thickened hooves, skin denser than expected, and eyes that appear to reflect infrared light. When one was found dead, its body oddly preserved, its organs showed anomalies. Enlarged adrenal glands, irregular bone density, and a strange yellowish fluid in place of blood plasma. They migrate in and out of the zone, but always return, always back to the reactor's shadow. So the question stands: are they surviving? Or are they becoming something else entirely? The zone's natural filtration systems. One of the earliest fears after the meltdown was contamination of groundwater, and reversed the idea that radioactive particles would bleed into the Dnieper basin and poison everything downstream. But something strange happened. It didn't spread as far as predicted. Certain hot zones remained hot, but downstream radiation didn't match early models. It was as if something was filtering the poison out. Scientists blamed sediment, natural settling, layers of clay. But that didn't explain why some streams inside the zone had lower radiation levels than areas untouched by water. Or why certain wetlands expected to be death traps were flourishing with life. Biologists began investigating. What they found were unexpected filtration patterns, dense root systems forming biobarriers, algae colonies clustering around isotopes, and even bacterial mats that seemed to feed on radioactive particles. In one case, a pond was entirely ringed with cattails genetically modified by nature to absorb cesium like a sponge. Nature, it seemed, had improvised a filtration system, but not evenly, not randomly. In some places, the water ran clear and clean where it should have been lethal. In others, pristine pools were inexplicably toxic. Almost like the land was choosing what to cleanse and what to keep contaminated. And what, exactly, it's preparing for. The Chernobyl graveyard of vehicles. They rest in rows like fallen soldiers' fire trucks, buses, cranes, tanks, machines that served, absorbed, and were left behind to rot. The vehicle graveyards of Chernobyl are more than scrap heaps. They are monuments to a moment when metal became mortal, when even steel had to be abandoned. These vehicles were exposed to levels of radiation that would kill a human in minutes. Many were used during the frantic early days transporting liquidators, dousing fires, bulldozing radioactive soil. Once contaminated beyond use, they were driven into remote fields and left under open sky. No burial, no ceremony. But they didn't die quietly. Visitors report electrical surges near certain trucks. Watches stop, cameras glitch. Some vehicles have been moved subtly repositioned, though no one admits to touching them. One fire engine in the main yard was found with its door ajar after being sealed shut for over a decade. There were footprints in the dust inside. No entry marks, no explanation. And the worst stories come from those who touch them. Not sickness, not burns, but nightmares recurring, precise, and shared. Same scenes, same screams. The graveyard is still, but stillness is not the same as rest. Especially when the engines never really cooled. The zone's whispering winds. It's just wind, they say. Air moving through shattered windows, rusted pipes, collapsed stairwells. The sound of a dead city exhaling. But inside the zone, wind doesn't always act like wind. It speaks. Visitors describe it as a murmur, not a howl, voices that don't quite form words, breaths that seem timed to footsteps. Some hear whispers only when standing still, others when they move too fast. One stalker called it the voice of the dust, always just behind him, always asking questions he couldn't understand. In some buildings, the phenomenon is eerily localized. A constant breeze in a sealed room, a stairwell that always sounds like someone is coming down but no one ever appears. The wind patterns aren't natural. They loop. They repeat. A breeze will come through the third floor, disappear on the fourth, then return identical 20 minutes later. Engineers blamed pressure shifts, vents, the complex geometry of ruins. But how do you explain the feeling that the wind knows when you're there? That it waits? One researcher placed an anemometer in a school hallway. It spun only when he spoke aloud. Wind is not supposed to answer back. But in Chernobyl, even the silence listens. And sometimes, It speaks. The Chernobyl microbial ecosystems. They found life where there should have been none. Microbial colonies deep inside the most irradiated parts of the zone, black fungi growing on reactor walls, bacteria thriving on graphite blocks, ecosystems birthed in death's cradle. These microbes don't just survive radiation, they consume it. Adapted, mutated, or something entirely new? Scientists were stunned. One particular strain of fungus appears to direct itself toward radiation, growing faster the more exposure it gets. Another bacterial colony shows a genetic pattern that suggests a kind of communication signals passed chemically between cells, shifting behavior in real time. These aren't passive survivors. They're active participants. Some theories suggest this is accelerated evolution. Others say it's more than that. A restructuring of life itself around radiation and alternative biological pathway. A few fringe researchers believe the zone is a cradle not just for new life, but a new kind of life. Samples transported outside the zone often die quickly, as if they need the radiation, or the place. And that raises a chilling idea, that the microbes aren't living in the zone, they are the zone. A nervous system forming, slowly, cell by cell. And if the zone is alive, these microbes might not be its parasites. They might be its neurons. The Chernobyl self-settlers' resilience. They were told to leave. Most did. But some came back. Elderly villagers, mostly. Women with kerchiefs tied tight. Men with boots worn smooth from years in the fields. The self-settlers. They returned to the zone despite the warnings, despite the danger, despite the fact that everything they knew had turned invisible and lethal. And somehow they lived. Years passed, then decades, and still they remained in their crumbling homes, tending goats, planting gardens, drinking well water that measured hot on Geiger counters. Medical teams expected mass illness, early death. But some of these returnees lived into their 80s and 90s, showing no outward signs of radiation sickness. A few outlived the very officials who evacuated them. Theories abounded: genetic quirks, natural resistance, psychosomatic denial. Some suggested their limited exposure post, meltdown allowed their bodies to adapt. Others believed it was simply luck. But one unsettling possibility emerged. What if the zone doesn't treat all people equally? What if, for some reason, it let them stay? These settlers speak softly about the forest, the soil, the air. They say it has moods. They say they've learned to listen to it. And maybe the zone listens back, granting survival as a kind of unspoken pact. The zone's unstable ground. Chernobyl's danger isn't just invisible, it's also beneath your feet. Long after the meltdown, the earth in parts of the exclusion zone began to shift. Sinkholes appeared where there were once roads. Entire sections of forest floor collapsed overnight, leaving behind craters lined with black sludge and rusted debris. And sometimes, the ground doesn't give way, it breathes, rising, falling, cracking under no weight at all. What began as isolated collapses turned into a pattern. Old service tunnels, sewage lines, and forgotten mine shafts had eroded under decades of neglect. But there are other theories. One team studying soil stability near Reactor 3 recorded seismic activity too weak to be considered earthquakes, but too regular to be natural. Small tremors, rhythmic, pulsing. Then there's the issue of heat. Certain patches of ground remain warm year-round, even in deep winter. Digging there often results in equipment malfunctioning or vanishing entirely. One stalker dropped a temperature probe into a shallow fissure and never got a reading. The rope burned clean through. Some believe there's something moving below. Not alive, perhaps, but active, shifting, rearranging. The foundations of the zone are cracked, not just physically but in meaning. And if the ground opens up, what exactly is trying to surface? The Chernobyl ghost dogs. Not every dog in the zone is flesh and blood. Among the real pack scavengers, Descendants of the pets left behind there are stories of others. Singular, silent, wrong. They don't bark, they don't eat, they follow, then vanish. And they're always seen alone. The ghost dogs of Chernobyl have become legend among stalkers. One is jet black, with eyes like melted glass. Another is bone white and leaves no tracks. Sightings often happen near Reactor 4 or in the dense woods beyond Pripyat, usually at dusk. One stalker described watching a dog for over an hour, unmoving, sitting at the center of a playground where no tracks led in or out. When he blinked, it was gone. There's something in the air when they appear, cold, but not wind, heavy, but not weight. People report feeling observed, not threatened, remembered, as if the zone is watching through borrowed eyes. Skeptics say it's trauma, the power of suggestion, animals mistaken in the twilight. But too many describe the same behaviors. The way the dogs seem to appear only when someone is alone. The way they look back, like they're asking something. And the most unsettling detail? No one's ever photographed one successfully. As if they know they're not supposed to be seen. The zone's hidden contamination plumes. Radiation isn't static. It moves. It seeps into cracks, clings to metal, dissolves into dust. But in the exclusion zone, radiation sometimes travels. Not randomly, not passively. With intent. These are the hidden contamination plumes, clouds of radioactive particles that move underground or in the air, detached from known sources. Some drift slowly across fields and vanish. Others seem to pulse, like breathing. One research drone recorded a plume rising from a marsh, drifting 50 meters, then dispersing without a Tricino wind, no disturbance. Groundwater makes it worse. In some places, the soil above appears clean, but dig half a meter down and Geiger counters scream. Some wells fluctuate wildly, measuring low 1 week, lethal the next. It's as if the land is exhaling pockets of radiation on its own cycle. Scientists proposed explanations: shifting water tables, decaying debris, capillary action in the soil. But none of these account for the rhythm, the patterns, the way certain areas always seem to pulse back to life on the same calendar days. Maybe the zone isn't leaking radiation. Maybe it's breeding it, concentrating it, moving it like blood through veins. And if that's true, then contamination isn't a relic. It's a strategy. The Chernobyl UFO sightings. It began with a flicker, just a speck of light above the tree line, seen by a control room technician at Reactor 4 hours before the explosion. He didn't report it. Who would believe a flashing orb in the sky? But he wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, multiple reports surfaced of strange aerial phenomena. Orange lights hovering motionless above the reactor, spinning disks over Pripyat, fast-moving glints that darted across the sky without sound. One firefighter described a shape like a plate that hovered over the burning building for nearly 6 minutes, pulsing red. His fellow responders told him to stop talking about it. He never did. Years later, declassified documents hinted at radar anomalies, that night objects appearing and disappearing without explanation. Some say it was experimental Soviet surveillance tech. Others whisper of foreign drones. But what if it wasn't military at all? A few researchers have gone further, suggesting the objects didn't arrive because of the explosion but before it, that they were watching, measuring, waiting. And perhaps the most disturbing thought isn't that something was hovering above the disaster, but that it was drawn to it, like a signal answered. Or, worse, like it had been invited. The zone's adaptive insects. You'd think the small ones wouldn't survive, that the insects would vanish, unable to withstand the micrograms of death drifting through the trees. But the opposite happened. They changed. Entomologists studying the zone's insect population found evidence of unnatural resilience. beetles with irradiated shells that still thrive, moths with wing patterns that resemble fractured radar signatures. Some mosquitoes exhibit erratic feeding behavior, only biting within certain distances of Reactor 4, as if drawn to specific frequencies. Then there's the fireflies, or something that looks like them. Some stalkers report seeing them blinking in binary-like patterns synchronized in clusters, as if responding to stimuli. One group lit a campfire and watched in awe as dozens of glowing insects formed a spiral in the air above it. It held for minutes, then scattered. Genetic tests have revealed chromosomal duplications in many species, suggesting accelerated adaptation, perhaps even preemptive mutation. They're not just surviving radiation, they're adjusting to it. In some cases, thriving on it. The question no one wants to ask is simple. What happens when the insects outgrow us? When they become vectors for something we can't yet see? Because evolution has always favored the small, the fast, the many, and the zone seems eager to help them win. The Chernobyl architectural anomalies. The buildings were rushed, yes, functional, Soviet, concrete stamped across the land like an ideology, but some parts of Chernobyl's infrastructure don't match the blueprints, especially within the reactor complex itself. Corridors that end in solid walls, but the blueprints show doors. Staircases that descend into pitch-black tunnels, unmarked, unfinished, but clearly used. Hidden rooms. Chambers behind reactor shielding walls with no identified purpose. One particularly bizarre find was a metal-lined room with nothing inside but a single chair bolted to the floor facing a blank wall. Workers who helped construct the plant recall sudden changes in designations. No one explained. Sections cordoned off by men who never wore uniforms. Research equipment, they were told. Contingency control. But no logs exist of these areas being maintained, powered, or even acknowledged. And they were never destroyed or decontaminated after the explosion. Stalkers who've managed to breach these areas report strange readings, electromagnetic interference, audio distortion, radiation spikes that vanish the moment a dosimeter clicks on. Some rooms appear completely untouched, as if preserved in vacuum. Others seem wrong, slanted, tilted, like the building is subtly rejecting its own geometry. Was it all just paranoid Cold War over-engineering? Or were they building something no one was meant to find? The zone's invisible barriers, physical. The maps say you can walk there. The ground looks clear. The Geiger counter is quiet. But something in your chest says, don't move forward. These are the zone's invisible barriers, not fences. Not gates, but walls you can't see and shouldn't cross. Stalkers speak of places where GPS fails without explanation, where shadows fall wrong at noon, where sound cuts out completely, like someone hit mute on the entire forest. In these areas, the air feels thick, but breathable. Time stretches. Lights flicker in your peripheral vision. One stalker described stepping through a birch grove and immediately vomiting, despite no chemical indicators. He turned back. The feeling stopped. Military patrols have flagged these areas without explanation. No signage, no formal records, just chalk marks on trees and silent shrugs. Some think they're residual heat pockets from underground contamination. Others suggest microbursts of magnetic interference. But a few believe these places aren't barriers at all. They're thresholds, points where the zone resists being entered or exited. Not because of radiation, but something older, something territorial. Because when a place begins to think, it doesn't need barbed wire. It just needs to make you feel unwelcome enough to stay out or trapped enough to stay in. The Chernobyl psychic residue. It starts as a feeling. A prickling on the back of the neck. A room that feels heavier than it should. A hallway where your own breath seems to echo like a whisper. This is what stalkers call psychic residue. The emotional burn marks left behind in the zone. Not ghosts, exactly. Something quieter. more intimate, like trauma that has sunk into the walls and refuses to die. In abandoned classrooms, visitors have reported sudden nausea, weeping fits, or feeling as though they're being watched. In hospitals, it's worse. There's a room in the Pripyat Medical Center where people regularly faint always at the same spot, beside a bed still stained with old iodine. Dosimeters remain stable, but something else is active. Emotional radiation. Some believe the extreme stress and terror during the evacuation imprinted onto the environment. That pain, like radiation, has a half-life, and in Chernobyl, it's still decaying, slowly. Parapsychologists who entered the zone reported symptoms of dissociation, dream echoes, and bleed-through phenomena moments where past and present blur. One recorded herself speaking and heard another voice answer in her own tone from behind her. In the zone, memory isn't always yours, and sometimes it remembers you before you arrive. The zone's changing landscape. Chernobyl is not what it was, and not just because of time or abandonment. The terrain itself seems to shift subtly, irregularly, and with increasing frequency. Entire groves vanish beneath moss in a single season. Trees grow in precise spirals, circling invisible centers. A pond once used for cooling reactors now sits 10 meters further west than maps recorded. Satellite imagery shows inconsistencies, not just growth but repositioning. An old train car near Yanov station disappeared for 5 months, then reappeared rusted, intact, 30 meters from its original location. No tracks lead to it, no drag marks, no explanation. Stalkers say the zone reorders itself, like a living organism adapting its limbs. One described a trail that once led to a storage warehouse, now ending in thick brush. The warehouse? Gone. A year later, it was back. Same building, same graffiti, a dream remade in concrete. Some suspect subsidence and erosion. Others blame memory itself failing under radiation, twisting perception. But maybe it's not perception that's breaking. Maybe it's order. Because the deeper you go, the less the land behaves like land and more like a thought, a place sculpted by will. Or by something learning how to shape the world from within. The Chernobyl lost photographs. Photographs were among the first things left behind. Albums, portraits, candid snapshots of birthday parties, weddings, school plays. Thousands of lives, frozen in time, abandoned in drawers, frames, wallets, and attics. Most were never recovered. Many were destroyed in the cleanup too, contaminated to touch, too human to ignore. But some remained, and the ones that remained began to change. A photo found in a Pripyat apartment showed a family of 4 smiling in their kitchen. When it was scanned digitally, a 5th figure appeared faintly in the background, partially transparent, facing away from the camera. The original showed nothing. The digital scan showed something else. It happened again and again. Photos of Reactor 4 before the explosion began, showing faint, black smudges stew, precise to be dust, too shapeless to be people. Stalkers trade these pictures like relics. Some claim certain photos feel cold to the touch. Others insist they hear faint static when they look too long. A few have burned their collections after dreams they couldn't shake. What do photos remember that we don't? Were they just victims of time and fallout? Or are they still developing in some hidden chemical bath the zone keeps for itself? And what happens when the images are ready? The zone's hidden treasures. Officially, evacuees were told to pack for 3 days, just the essentials, leave everything else. But not everyone followed the script. Some buried their valuables. Others hid them in walls, stoves, attics. They believed they would return. When they didn't, the treasures waited, and over time, they became something else. Stalkers tell of strange finds rooms filled with pre-1986 currency, jewelry tucked inside hollowed-out encyclopedias, a safe embedded in a floorboard containing not money, but a chessboard made entirely of human teeth. Some caches seem inexplicably untouched by time bread still soft, vodka still sealed, mirrors uncracked in a house where every window is shattered. But then there are the treasures no one ever sees, the ones people search for and never find. Some say there are entire basements under Pripyat, filled with confiscated heirlooms, gold melted into bricks, artworks never catalogued. Others believe former party officials hid record tapes, documents, even prototypes of experimental tech underneath buildings that no longer exist. One stalker claimed he found a suitcase under the school gym. Inside, children's drawings, all depicting the same exact burning tower. He buried it again. Because maybe some treasures aren't meant to be retrieved. Maybe they're buried not to preserve them but to contain them. The Chernobyl birds song. At first, it sounded like silence. But that wasn't quite right. The birds were there. They moved. They nested. But they didn't sing not the way they were supposed to. The melodies were off, flattened, slowed, warped, like a warped cassette tape left in the sun. Ornithologists studying the zone noticed that many bird species had altered vocalizations. The nightingale's sanga, once rich, rolling series of notes, now rang hollow, its timing staggered. Swallows chirped in dissonant loops, repeating phrases like broken instruments. Some birds mimicked mechanical sounds, Geiger counters, sirens, the low hum of turbines that haven't run in decades. More disturbing were the newcomer species never documented in the region, arriving with strange, rhythmic calls that didn't match any known catalog. One researcher recorded an extended song resembling Morse code. When translated, it spelled nothing, but the structure was undeniably deliberate. Some believe the radiation affected their neurology. Others think it's learned behavior calls, shaped by a soundscape of sirens and silence. But a few insist the zone is teaching them something new. And the birds, they're remembering it. Because when nature stops singing in the language it once knew, maybe it's not a mutation. Maybe it's a message. The zone's untold heroism. The word hero is too clean for what really happened. It doesn't account for panic, confusion, or the way courage looks when no one is filming. Yet across the exclusion zone, in the shadows of silence and censorship, thousands of anonymous acts took place, and none of them recorded, many of them forgotten. These are the untold heroics, the unfiled valor, the decisions made in seconds that likely saved thousands and doomed dozens. A janitor who barricaded the kindergarten basement, shielding local children from radiation with furniture and prayer. A technician who manually opened a stuck valve, knowing the exposure would mean his death. A bus driver who went off route to evacuate a village before orders were given, and was later reprimanded, not thanked. These people didn't write memoirs. They weren't honored. Some were never even listed in evacuation reports. They just did what needed to be done, then vanished either into the bureaucracy or into shallow graves dug in contaminated soil. Why weren't their names preserved? Perhaps the system didn't know how to reward disobedient courage, or maybe the zone itself keeps its own kind of ledger, written in ash, silence, and memory. Because sometimes, the greatest heroism goes unnoticed on purpose. The Chernobyl firefighters' last moments. They were the first to arrive, the first to breathe in the invisible death, the ones who mistook glowing graphite for coal, who handled it with bare hands. The firefighters of Chernobyl weren't told what they were fighting. They thought it was a fire. They brought water and grit. The zone brought everything else. Official reports offer timelines, arrival, exposure, collapse. But the real stories, the final hours are fragmented and whispered. Nurses spoke of burns that deepened in seconds, skin that peeled with a touch, pupils that turned cloudy like milk. One man's internal organs liquefied before the ambulance left the power plant gates. And yet they stayed. One climbed the roof again after vomiting blood. Another carried a colleague who couldn't walk. Their suits were inadequate, their training irrelevant. But they kept returning to the blaze. Some of their last words were recorded. "Tell my mother I did good. Don't let it be for nothing." Others couldn't speak. Their throats had gone raw from breathing radiation. No statues capture their exact expressions. No medals undo what was done. And yet, their last moments weren't just tragic, they were defiant. Because they ran into the inferno not to survive, but so others might. And the zone remembers Thembi. The silence they left behind. The zone's subterranean life. Above ground, the zone decays in sunlight. Below, it thrives in shadow. There are entire ecosystems beneath Chernobyl's crumbling facade networks of roots, fungi, insects, and rodents that have claimed the abandoned subway tunnels, maintenance shafts, storm drains, and reactor substructures as their own. But what lives down there doesn't just adapt, it transforms. Explorers have documented rats with dulled eyes and near-total nocturnality, spider colonies that build web patterns with unusual geometric regularity, and a species of blind centipede that glows faintly under UV light. But some reports are harder to quantify, like the sound of movement in corridors with no visible entry points, or entire chambers coated in what appears to be fungal tissue, pulsing slightly, as if breathing. One biologist described a living wall of lichen and mold that seemed to retract from her flashlight beam. She returned the next day. The room had collapsed. How deep do these networks go? Some believe the biological web under the zone now spans several square kilometers, operating independently. An organic infrastructure beneath the ruins of the technological one. And if it's growing in the dark, it means it's hiding. Which begs the question, what happens when the subterranean stops avoiding use and starts reaching up? The Chernobyl shadow people. It starts with a glimpse just out of frame. A shape moving where there shouldn't be one. The corner of a figure just as the flashlight flickers. Shadow people. They're not called ghosts. That word is too old, too warm, too full of grief. This is something colder, something darker, something that doesn't want to be understood, only seen. Stalkers report them in the abandoned corridors of Pripyat, in stairwells that descend past the limits of architecture, and most often near the sarcophagus of Reactor 4. They don't speak. They don't interact. They only watch, and when you try to approach, they're gone. No footsteps, no trail, just air that feels heavier and a sense that something is still standing behind you. Cameras malfunction. Battery life drains. One stalker claimed he filmed one walking through the ruins of a hospital, but when he played the footage back, the figure had no legs. It simply floated. The film caught nothing else for the next 10 minutes. Just static. Are they radiation-induced hallucinations? Traumatized projections? Or something birthed from the trauma itself, like memories that learned how to walk? In Chernobyl, some shadows aren't cast by light. They're left behind by events that never fully ended. The zone's natural remediation. Nature always returns. That's the story we like to tell. But in the zone, nature didn't just return, it adapted, reorganized, healed in ways that don't always make sense. Some parts of the exclusion zone, once highly contaminated, show inexplicably low radiation levels, not due to cleanup, not due to time, but something working beneath the surface. Soil bacteria that bind cesium, plants that absorb isotopes and don't die, trees growing in impossibly straight lines, as if following unseen instructions. Biologists refer to it as natural remediation, but the process is too focused, too selective. Entire sections of the Red Forest, once declared dead, now host flora, with mutated root systems designed to trap radioactive particles. Streams that should be toxic now support fish. Mosses grow in radial patterns around hotspots, as if absorbing the danger like sponges. Some believe this is simply rapid evolution survival under pressure, but the symmetry, the consistency, suggests something else. coordination, intelligence, even. One ecologist called it self-correcting memory, the land remembering what it was and trying to return not by reverting, but by redefining. But when the environment starts healing itself on its own terms, we have to ask, is it fixing the wound? Or replacing the patient? The Chernobyl ghost trains. The tracks are rusted, the switches seized, the lines have been silent for decades, and yet people still hear them. The low metallic groan of wheels, a whistle in the distance. Vibrations felt through concrete platforms where no train has passed since 1986. They call them the ghost trains of Chernobyl. The reports come mostly from near Yanov Station, where freight once moved between Pripyat and the wider Soviet industrial network. Now it's a graveyard of boxcars and locomotives, many still coated in radioactive dust. But at night, some stalkers swear they see movement on the rail slides that appear briefly, then vanish. Sounds of engines that can't exist. One group camped near the tracks reported waking up to find boot prints in the gravel beside them. Just one set. No train, no person. A former railway worker, now retired, once claimed the zone refused to let certain trains pass. He believed one had disappeared entirely, a medical transport during the early days of evacuation. No wreckage, no passengers, no end of the line. Are these hallucinations? Echoes of machinery in a place where time is warped? Or are the trains still running in some way, delivering what was never received? And if so, who's still riding them? The zone's hidden graves. Officially, the dead of Chernobyl were buried with ceremony and containment. Lead-lined coffins, sealed plots, concrete over sorrow. But between the official funerals and the chaotic evacuations, something got lost, or rather something stayed behind. There are graves in the zone that no one marked, pets buried in gardens, family members who died before help arrived, babies who were born and didn't survive, the stress, the exposure, the silence, shallow mounds in forest clearings, clusters of stone circles behind cottages, crosses nailed to trees without names, weather-worn and crooked. Stalkers find these places by accident, a bone poking from moss, a bundle of cloth hidden beneath rusted sheet metal. In some areas, dogs avoid certain patches of ground, circling wide around spots that look on the surface innocent. Some graves are clearly makeshift, but others look like they've been tended. Recently, fresh flowers that couldn't have lasted more than a few days, candles burned halfway down. Who's maintaining them? Who even remembers where they are? Some suspect returnee self-settlers honoring their dead in secret. Others believe these are the zone's waypoints. That memory itself is rooted to these patches of dirt. Because in Chernobyl, forgetting is impossible. The ground refuses to let go. The Chernobyl resonance. There's a hum in the zone that never stops. Not quite a sound, not quite a vibration, more like a presence. Sensitive instruments sometimes pick it up. Low-frequency oscillations that move through concrete, soil, even water. Human ears can't always hear it, but the body knows. Migraines, nosebleeds. The sensation that the inside of your skull is vibrating just slightly out of sync with the world. They call it resonance. Some believe it's electromagnetic interference from the remnants of Soviet infrastructure. Others claim it's the Earth itself, groaning beneath the weight of what happened here. But there's a third idea, darker and harder to dismiss. That something was imprinted in the zone the moment Reactor 4 ruptured. Not a sound, but an echo of an event so massive it continues to reverberate through time and matter. One physicist described it as an emotional frequency. He theorized that when people experience extreme fear or pain, they leave behind a signal. And Chernobyl didn't just traumatize individuals, it traumatized the land. Could the zone be transmitting its own grief? Could the resonance be a call, a warning, or even a heartbeat? And if so, what exactly is it waiting for in return? The zone's evolving flora. They shouldn't be able to grow like this. Not here, not now. And yet they doe ferns taller than they should be, saplings with twisted double trunks, wildflowers that bloom out of season and in unnatural symmetry. The flora of Chernobyl isn't just surviving, it's evolving. Botanists studying the zone's plant life have found strange anomalies in growth cycles, pigmentation, and cellular structure. Certain flowers now appear to reflect ultraviolet light patterns that mimic radioactive warning symbols. Others seem to grow in direct response to background radiation, clustering in hot zones as if drawn to the danger, not repelled by it. Even more disturbing are the hybrid splants that don't match any known species. They sprout along the edges of forgotten villages, often in geometric clusters. Some grow in perfect spirals, others in branching formations eerily similar to neural networks, as if the land is growing thoughts, memories. One researcher attempted to transplant a unique ivy variant outside the zone. It died within days. This isn't just evolution, it's coherence. The zone shaping its greenery into something functional, organized, possibly even strategic. And if plants are learning here, what language are they speaking? And more urgently, who or what are they learning from? The Chernobyl unfinished structures. There are buildings in the zone that were never completed, skeletons of ambition frozen mid-breath. Construction halted not by lack of funds or poor planning, but by the invisible wave of fallout that turned every blueprint into a mausoleum. Half-built hospitals, sports centers, apartment blocks, all still standing, caught in a moment that never arrived. But something about them is different. They don't decay like the rest. Their walls remain strangely intact, unmarked by graffiti, untouched by time. One apartment complex on the outskirts of Pripyat was never officially completed, yet its hallways are unnaturally clean. No mold, no animals, no dust. One stalker claimed it smelled like fresh paint. He never returned. Some believe these structures are stuck in temporal limbo caught between intention and abandonment. Others suspect they were never meant to be public at all. Secret projects under the guise of civilian use. Radiation research? Containment testing? Or something even more abstract, an architectural experiment in a place already primed for collapse? In a world where nothing is finished and everything ends, these buildings remain unborn, uninhabited, and impossibly preserved. It's almost as if the zone is saving them. But for what? And for who? The zone's mysterious depths. No one has ever truly mapped the lower levels of Reactor 4. After the explosion, molten core materialava-like, radioactive, and impossibly unstable flowed downward, eating through pipes, chambers, and structural supports. Some of it solidified into monstrous formations, some of it disappeared entirely, and deep below, beneath the known maps, are levels no one has dared return to. They're flooded now, partially collapsed, but still active. Instruments sent down by drone return erratic data, inconsistent radiation levels, strange magnetic pulses, signal interference. Some feeds simply go black. One submersible deployed into a submerged chamber returned with 2 minutes of usable footage, murky, distorted, and then static. But frame-by-frame analysis revealed something odd. Movement. Not water, not debris, something deliberate. There's also the cooling pond still there, a vast reservoir that once served the reactors. It's been sealed, monitored, written off. And yet divers report disturbing anomalies, thermal signatures with no source, unusual currents, sounds that seem mechanical in origin. No one's gone deep enough to know what's still down there, or if it's still changing. The lower levels of the zone aren't just dangerous, they're unknown. And what lies beneath Chernobyl's heart may not be finished with us yet. The Chernobyl sirens call. Why do people keep going back? Stalkers say it's the quiet, the freedom, the emptiness. But that's not the whole truth. There's something else, a pull, not physical, not even emotional, something deeper. A longing that doesn't belong to you, but grows in your bones the longer you stay away. They call it the siren's call. It begins subtly, a dream, a sound, an ache behind the eyes when looking at photographs of Pripyat. Then, a craving, a compulsion to return to walk the cracked roads, breathe the filtered air, listen to the dead wires hum. Some who've never been feel it too, as if the zone is calling them before they arrive. And it doesn't stop once you leave. Many return again and again, even after injury, after sickness. One woman described it as a memory that needs me to complete it. Another stalker brought back a rock, just a chunk of concrete. 2 weeks later, he smashed it with a hammer, said it had been whispering. Scientists laugh at off psychological imprint, obsession, trauma bonding. But what if it's not in their minds? What if the zone wants to be seen? What if it's luring people one by one because it remembers what it was missing? Witnesses, the zone's unpredictable hotspots. Radiation doesn't play fair in the zone. It doesn't decay in a straight line or follow the polite physics of textbooks. It pulses, disappears, reappears in places already scanned and cleared. These are the unpredictable hotspot small, shifting areas where radiation levels spike without pattern or precedent. One moment, a Geiger counter reads safe. Seconds later, the same patch of ground hums like a war drum. The next day, it's inert again. Stalkers have walked through these pockets untouched, only to feel nausea hours later, their skin prickling as if it remembered what the meter forgot. Cleanup crews have no explanation. They map the area, tag anomalies, return weeks later to find the readings inverted. Sometimes, radiation appears in cluster triangular shapes or long, narrow paths that mirror old evacuation routes. One such hotspot aligned perfectly with the shadow cast by a collapsed smokestack, though no source remained. Are these microbursts of decay? Hidden reservoirs leaking upward? Or something stranger movements of the zone itself, like a living body circulating its poison? Whatever the mechanism, the result is the same. Safety is a lie. And the land doesn't forget where it's been hurt. It simply decides where that pain surfaces next. The Chernobyl, echo of children's voices. They're heard in places no one wants to stay. School corridors, empty playgrounds, the gutted shell of the Pripyat amusement park. Laughter, footsteps, sometimes crying, always faint. Always just around the corner. Visitors call them hallucinations. The mind filling the silence with what it expects, what it fears, but too many accounts are too consistent. One woman, a former teacher, described hearing the national anthem being sung in a child's voice from the ruins of school number N3. She approached. No one there. Just old desks overturned and a decaying map of the USSR. Audio recorders occasionally capture the echoes. Not full words, but tones, cadence. A giggle beneath a burst of wind. A counting rhyme that never finishes. Some say it's psychic residue trauma looping through abandoned spaces. Others suggest more, that children are the most impressionable, that they leave deeper marks on a place than adults. And maybe, just maybe, what echoes back isn't memory at all but imitation. Because the zone doesn't just hold on to radiation, it holds on to childhood. And somewhere in its rusted lungs, it's still playing the games they never got to finish. The zone's ancient trees. The forests of the zone are reclaiming everything. Buildings, roads, entire towns. But within that regrowth are trees that shouldn't still be standing. Massive oaks, twisted pines, and knot-covered birches estimated to be hundreds of years old, far older than the buildings that surround them. They weren't noted on pre-disaster surveys. They don't appear on forestry maps. And yet they're here, towering over rusted fences, growing out of concrete, their bark thick with age and something else. One birch near the Red Forest has rings that suggest it predates Pripyat by a century. Another oak, scorched but still living, survived the initial fallout and continues to grow its branches, oddly symmetrical, as if groomed by unseen hands. Biologists have tried to date them. The samples come back inconclusive. One tree returned conflicting carbon readings, its core suggesting multiple growth periods, like it died and restarted. Another produced sap that crystallized into dark amber overnight. These aren't survivors. They're sentinels, watchers, witnesses from a time before maps, before reactors, before warning sirens. And if they've been here this long, through fires and fallout, then they aren't just adapted. They're chosen, standing silent while everything else collapses, watching us forget. The Chernobyl lost art. It wasn't just people who were evacuated, it was creativity, murals, statues, mosaics, and street art all abandoned overnight, left behind like stray thoughts frozen in concrete. The zone is full of silent galleries. Lenin busts half sunken into mud. Mosaics in kindergarten halls flaking off piece by piece. Theater curtains left drawn forever. But some of the art has gone missing. A large mural that once adorned the Pripyat Cultural Center depicting idealized Soviet workers reaching toward the atom was documented in the 1990s, still intact. By 2004, it had disappeared. Not degraded, removed. Entire panels gone without evidence of collapse or looting. Another statue, a stylized dove of peace, vanished from outside the secondary school. The plinth remains. The bird does not. Some believe scavengers took these peace as souvenirs of ideological decay. Others whisper of quiet retrieval operations, where officials return to collect artifacts that contain state secrets embedded in plain sight. But a third theory lingers like dust, that the art removed itself, that the zone doesn't just corrode, it edits. And what better symbol of a failed utopia than artwork that rewrites itself, removing what no longer fits? Because maybe, in Chernobyl, even the paint knows how to forget. The zone's silent watchers. Walk through the exclusion zone, and you'll eventually feel it, the sensation of being observed, not by drones or guards or other humans, by animals, deer, foxes, wild dogs, wolves, standing perfectly still, watching from just beyond the trees, eyes unmoving, unblinking, as if they understand exactly what you are and, more importantly, what you're not. They don't flee like normal wildlife. They don't charge either. They watch, and then they vanish. Some stalkers believe these are just adaptive behaviors, generations of animals learning human patterns, but others aren't so sure. One group reported a fox appearing at multiple checkpoints during a 3-day journey. Same markings, same scar on the right ear, same distance, as if escorting them or studying them. There are also reports of birds following routes overhead, dogs shadowing paths without engaging. In one case, a group of wild boars was seen circling an abandoned church 3 times before disappearing into the woods. Are they simply surviving? Or has something shifted, a new kind of awareness, seeded by exposure, silence, and time? Because when the creatures of the zone stop running, stop fearing, and start watching, it might mean they've learned what we haven't: how to become part of the silence. The Chernobyl invisible barrier, social. You can escape the radiation. You can leave the zone. But you can't outrun the stigma. For the people of Pripyat and the surrounding areas, exile didn't end at relocation. They were labeled contaminated, exposed, irradiated, moved into distant towns where neighbors whispered and jobs dried up. Children were kept at arm's length. Mothers were told not to breastfeed. Some families changed their surnames just to disappear from the disaster's shadow. This is the invisible barrier, the wall built not of steel but suspicion, a psychic quarantine that followed evacuees for decades. Survivors report being passed over for promotions, denied medical treatment, even refused housing. Not because of what they'd done, but because of where they had been. And the strangest part? Some began to internalize it, to believe they were cursed, that they carried something unseen and inescapable, a mark. Sociologists tried to document it. Most were ignored, because shame doesn't make good press, and denial is easier than guilt. But trauma isn't always radioactive. Sometimes it's just social. And for the displaced, the wound wasn't just being forced out of their homes. It was learning that the world outside had already built a fence to keep them out. The zone's secret passages. Most people see ruin-crumbling stairwells, blown-out windows, collapsed rooftops. But look closer, and you'll find a second layer beneath the rot. Locked doors in places where there shouldn't be rooms, ladders leading to no recorded floor, tunnel entrances sealed with rusted iron that wasn't part of the original construction. The zone is riddled with secret passages, corridors, and crawl spaces no official blueprint admits to. Some were likely built for pragmatic reasons. Soviet infrastructure was always threaded with paranoia, escape routes, emergency access tunnels, service shafts. But many of these paths go nowhere practical. A maintenance tunnel in Pripyat's hospital number. 6 loops underground for 40 meters, then ends in a small concrete room with a bolted chair and scorched walls. No equipment, no explanation. A few stalkers claim to have found passageways that connect buildings across entire districts' unmarked routes beneath the schools, factories, and housing blocks. One led to a sub-basement lined with glass jars filled with preserved rodent, some of them deformed, others still twitching. Why were these passages hidden? Were they abandoned experiments, or were they meant to be hidden from the beginning? And if someone built them to move unseen between the walls of the zone, then that means someone or something still could. The Chernobyl Memory Palace. The zone is more than a physical place, it's a map of memory. Not personal memory, but collective, ambient, territorial. Pripyat especially feels like a neural network turned inside out. Its rooms are mnemonic devices. Its alleys, synapses. The city remembers itself, and it wants you to remember too. Walk long enough, and strange patterns emerge. Repeating layouts, schools with identical classroom numbers, housing blocks where every third door is painted blue, always slightly ajar. It feels designed to be recalled, as if it were built for the sole purpose of later being walked through in hindsight. Some researchers believe the city's uniform Soviet architecture creates the illusion of recognition. But that doesn't explain the uncanny familiarity some first-time visitors report. Dreams of stairwells. Flashbacks of halls they've never entered. One man burst into tears upon seeing a mural in the Palace of Culture. He'd never been to Pripyat. Was the city structured to imprint itself? Or has the zone rewired itself into a living memory palace zone that uses ruin as recollection? And if memory can be stored in space, then what happens when a place remembers more than the people who built it? What if it starts remembering you? The zone's untouched time. Decay is universal. Mold grows, paint flakes, floors buckle. But not everywhere, not in the zone. Certain rooms remain pristine, untouched by 30 years of silence and moisture. Schoolrooms with chalk still on the board, beds made, tables set for dinners that never came. Even the dust seems politely distributed. These aren't curated. They're not part of any tourist site. They're deep inside the exclusion boundary, accessible only to those who wander long enough and deep enough. And when you enter them, time feels wrong. Watches slow, phones glitch, light takes on a different hue. One stalker described it as stepping into a photograph that hadn't finished being taken. Some theorize these rooms were hermetically sealed by accident, pockets of environmental stability. Others suspect localized microclimates, bizarre intersections of airflow and structure. But the eeriness isn't in the preservation, it's in the feeling. Because in these places, the past isn't behind glass. It's waiting. It hasn't ended yet. And sometimes, things inside these rooms are different. Toys sitting in new positions, chairs facing new directions. No one sees them move, they just are. What if the zone isn't letting time pass in these places? What if it's keeping moments alive for someone's return? The Chernobyl dog pack dynamics. They've never left. Not really. The dogs of Chernobyl, descendants of abandoned pets, survivors of starvation, mutation, and memory, have become a society of their own. Packs roam through the zone with a structure and rhythm more complex than biologists ever expected, and the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. On the outskirts, the dogs behave like feral animals, territorial, defensive, but near the heart around Pripyat and the reactor perimeter, they become something else. Packs move in silence, coordinated. One group scouts ahead, while another trails behind. Their hierarchy isn't based on size or aggression, but something more communicative, as if decisions are made without a sound. Some dogs have been observed watching humans, not with fear or hunger, but discernment, following for days, sleeping near, but not with, always observing. A few individuals have been seen moving between packs, acting as messengers or sentinels, roles too defined to be instinctual. Researchers tried tagging them. Many of the tags disappeared. One group of tagged dogs returned to the exact same building every day at dusk as if reporting. What have they learned after decades in the zone? And what if they aren't just surviving it, but serving it? The zone's whispering rivers. The Pripyat River still runs, slow and deliberate, carving its path through the decaying beauty of the zone. It moves past the skeletons of docks, through reeds that glow faintly in moonlight. And sometimes when the wind dies and the forest holds its breath, you can hear it whisper. Not water, not wind, something beneath, echoes that don't match the splash, hissing that doesn't match the current. Some say it sounds like voices, mumbling just below the surface. A few claim to hear music melodies from the Soviet era, barely distinguishable, like a record warped by time. The rivers have always been the zone's vein-scarring contamination, memory, debris, but perhaps they're more than transport. Perhaps they're transmission. Geiger counters sometimes spike for no reason when standing near the banks. Fish jump in synchronized rhythm. Ripples move against gravity. One stalker dropped a recorder into the water for 10 minutes. When played back, the tape began with silence, then breathing. Then a single word, unintelligible and wet, spoken in a voice that didn't belong to anyone alive. Is the water remembering, or is it learning how to speak? Because when rivers whisper, it means they're listening too. And something downstream might be waiting to answer. The Chernobyl unheard cries. Some pain makes no sound, not because it's weak, but because it's too vast for language. The cries from Chernobyl weren't always heard, not by authorities, not by neighbors, not even by history. These are the unheard cries, the invisible grief of those who lost more than homes or health. They lost continuity, family lines, futures, meaning. Survivors speak of this silence. Children who developed cancers too early to name, parents who buried them quietly, then never spoke again. Lovers who disappeared into the evacuation system, separated forever by bureaucracy and fear. And those who stayed behind there by choice or by failure of the system, who were never registered as gone. But perhaps most haunting are the ones who couldn't cry at all. The infants born malformed, the ones who lived only a few minutes, the ones who never made it into any statistic. Grief curdles in the zone. It doesn't fade. It just folds itself into walls, trees, rivers. Some say that's why the air is so heavy. Why the wind hisses through abandoned stairwells like breath being held too long. Chernobyl was loud when it exploded, but it's the quiet afterward that never ends. Because silence isn't absence, it's memory without a voice. The zone's geological shifts. At first, it was dismissed as natural decay, roads cracking, walls leaning, entire buildings tilting into the embrace of time. But then the Earth itself began to move in ways that couldn't be so easily explained. Sinkholes appeared where no soft ground should exist. Foundations warped overnight. Trees sprouted at unnatural angles, bending toward a center no one could find. These aren't earthquakes. There's no tectonic justification. The seismic sensors, still active in some sectors of the zone, don't register what's happening. And yet, it happens. Quietly. Persistently. Like the land is rearranging itself beneath the rust. Some areas once considered stable are now riddled with fractures. Entire blocks in Pripyat now slope slightly west, though no structural change was recorded between satellite passes. In 2022, a team placed a series of ground anchors along a disused service tunnel. 2 weeks later, all were pulled inward, as if by force toward a point now flooded and inaccessible. Is this erosion? Or is it geological memory, old wounds surfacing, old boundaries slipping? Perhaps the land itself is trying to unmake the grid laid over it. Perhaps it's remembering a shape that predates blueprints and boundaries. And what happens when the ground no longer supports what we buried? The Chernobyl lost identities. They left with suitcases, not names. And for many, that was the beginning of erasure. Evacuees from Chernobyl didn't just lose homes, they lost roles, reputations, roots. Entire villages were absorbed into the gray blur of relocation. Documents misplaced, families split. One man arrived in Kiev to find someone else living under his name assigned by clerical error. He became a number. Children grew up without official birth records. Teenagers born near the zone were quietly encouraged to start over elsewhere. Teachers, engineers, midwives all became former versions of themselves. Their pasts were seen as radioactive, even if they weren't. Identity became toxic by proximity. And the deeper loss was internal. Survivors report dissociation, fractured memory, the sensation of watching their lives from a distance. As if Chernobyl didn't just irradiate the body, but dissolved the self. Some never spoke of it again. Others built entire new personas, denying they had ever lived there. But every now and then something slips. A song remembered, a smell, a dream that takes place in a building you haven't seen in decades. Because Chernobyl didn't just steal land. It rewrote the people who left the originals wandering somewhere behind. Still unclaimed, still unresolved. The zone's hidden water features. They don't appear on any maps. Not the Soviet ones, not the modern ones. And yet they exist, small springs bubbling through cracked concrete, stagnant pools behind collapsed fences, shallow ponds that shimmer under moonlight in places that should be dry. These are the zone's hidden water features. And they aren't normal. Some contain water that smells metallic, thick with minerals no one can identify. Others are crystal clear, eerily still, reflecting skies that look subtly wrong, clouds that don't match the weather overhead. One stalker claimed a puddle near Reactor 3 showed stars at noon. He watched it for hours before passing out. His watch stopped at 3:17. It was never the same again. In one case, a narrow stream spontaneously appeared overnight, cutting through a path used daily by researchers. The source could not be located. The stream dried up 2 days later, leaving behind a line of dead grass shaped like a question mark. Are these anomalies the result of shifting aquifers, collapsed pipes, or are they environmental wound steers in the fabric of the land that leak something older, stranger? And if the zone is bleeding from beneath, then perhaps these waters aren't sources. They're messages, written in reflection, meant to be misread. The Chernobyl unsung heroes. The textbooks name the engineers, the plaques list the first responders, the documentaries loop the same half-dozen faces. But behind the official stories lies a chorus of the forgotten ordinary people who acted in extraordinary moments and never told anyone, not because they were silenced, because they never thought they deserved to be heard. A bus driver who made 5 extra loops through rural roads, picking up villagers long after the evacuation deadline. A young nurse who stayed in the contaminated ward to comfort dying men, then disappeared into the relocation system. A cook who fed hundreds of liquidators without protection, then slipped away before her name could be logged. These were the unsung, the backbone of every operation, the civilians who weren't supposed to be there, who showed up anyway, who were told to leave but stayed, who saved others and then kept walking. Some are known only through secondhand stories. Others left cryptic notes, unsigned letters, or scratched initials in the walls of shelters now caved in. No medals, no memoirs. Just presence, impact, and eventual disappearance. They weren't remembered because they didn't need to be. But the zone remembers. Because sometimes the greatest heroism isn't performed, it's absorbed. The zone's regenerative power. By all logic, it should be barren, toxic, dead. But the zone pulses with life. Not just weeds and bugs, entire ecosystems rebuilt from scratch, thriving in contamination, adapting faster than scientists can catalog. This isn't resilience, it's something closer to defiance. Fungi that feed on radiation, turning decay into nourishment. Trees growing back in perfect formation after wildfires. Species of birds that were believed extinct, spotted nesting in Pripyat's gutted apartments. Life not only returns, it improvises. The soil, once written off as poison for centuries, now produces strange mosses that absorb isotopes and convert them into inert material. Certain ponds contain algae that glow faintly and seem to self-regulate their exposure levels. Even some mammals show signs of accelerated healing and generational adaptation. Researchers don't use the word miracle. They call it unusual resilience. But it's not just nature pushing back, it's nature rewriting the rules. A slow, patient uprising not against humanity, but against finality. Maybe Chernobyl didn't destroy the ecosystem. Maybe it tore off the leash. And what's growing now doesn't just survive the zone. It belongs to it. And soon, maybe, everything else will too. The Chernobyl psychological scars. You don't have to breathe radiation to be wounded by it. Some traumas skip the bloodstream and go straight for the soul. The psychological scars of Chernobyl cut generations deep, unseen, unmeasured, and unresolved. Children born years after the disaster report nightmares of fire, sirens, and faceless men in masks. Teenagers, raised far from the zone, describe anxiety they can't trace. Survivors avoid mirrors. Avoid silence. Some report memory lapses, not tied to age or illness, but to avoidance, as if parts of their own lives have been blacked out by emotional radiation. Therapists call it collective trauma, but that term feels small in the shadow of Reactor 4. There are stories of people who developed obsessive rituals after evacuation, checking dosimeters that were no longer needed, washing hands until they bled, refusing to touch paper money. One woman refused to speak for 3 years after being relocated. When she finally did, her first words were, "The sky lied." How do you treat a wound caused by knowing? By remembering a silence so thick it still echoes? Chernobyl didn't just scar the land, it rewrote the human mind. And somewhere deep in the psyche, that siren is still going off. We've just trained ourselves not to hear it. The zone's shifting sands. The exclusion zone doesn't just decay, it migrates. Over the years, small dunes of ash, sand, and topsoil have begun to shift, building strange mounds in the middle of roads, swallowing fences, burying vehicles like sleeping giants. These aren't ordinary sand drifts. They move too deliberately, collect in patterns too precise, and often center on locations of historical or radioactive significance. One particularly troubling formation near the remains of Kindergarten Number 5 seemed to form an almost perfect spiral over the course of several seasons. Another ridge appeared near the edge of the Red Forest, and aligned exactly with a fallout path from the original explosion, despite the terrain being flat for decades. Some suspect it's just wind in time, but others, those who've walked these paths for years, disagree. They say the Earth moves too quickly here, that entire structures are lost beneath layers of dust overnight. That shapes appear in the landscape, vanish, and then re-emerge somewhere else, like the zone is thinking with soil. It raises a strange possibility. What if the zone doesn't just hold memories, it relocates them? What if it covers its scars not to heal, but to hide? And how long before it buries everything it no longer wants us to find? The Chernobyl ghost hunters. They come with cameras, EMF readers, thermal scopes, hope, desperation. The ghost hunters of Chernobyl don't wear lab coats, they wear GoPros, night vision goggles, and half-formed trauma. They aren't here to measure radiation. They're here to hear voices, to catch glimpses of the past looking back. And sometimes, they do. Footage from abandoned dormitories shows shadows moving in complete silence. No insects, no dust, no wind, just presence. A cold that moves against gravity. One hunter, a hardened skeptic, filmed a stairwell where lights danced along the railings. He claimed it was electrical feedback. Until he reviewed the footage and saw his own silhouette duplicated behind him, mimicking his every move only half a beat too slow. They bring offerings, flowers, toys, photos. One group left a tape recorder in the Ferris wheel at dusk. It played back 2 hours of wind and then a child's voice reciting a counting game in Russian. Backwards. Of course, none of it is provable. None of it is science. But Chernobyl doesn't play by those rules anymore. Maybe the ghost hunters aren't looking for spirits. Maybe the zone is using them to be remembered. And maybe that's the real haunting. History, refusing to stay dead. The zone's silent growth. Decay makes noise, creaks, cracks, collapse. But in Chernobyl, growth is the quiet intruder. Trees pierce rooftops. Ivy wraps its way around stairwells. Grass pushes through tile like it was always meant to be there. And it all happens in silences low, relentless, and eerily intentional. The vegetation in the zone doesn't just reclaim, it infiltrates, it adapts. Vines have been seen curling not toward the sun, but toward warm gene casings, battery packs, even human body heat. Some mosses grow only along walls that still hum with residual static, forming outlines around electrical conduits long since dead. Researchers once monitored a hallway in a Pripyat school for seasonal changes. Over 2 years, the same patch of vines grew in the exact same shape 3 times 7 after being removed. When they mapped the growth against historical photographs, the pattern matched the silhouette of a student mural lost in the explosion. Silent, coordinated, intentional? Maybe. The zone doesn't need to roar to reclaim. It just waits, slowly, patiently, until every line humans drew fades under green and gray. Because in Chernobyl, it's not just rot that spreads without warning. It's life. But a kind that doesn't need permission and doesn't ask questions. The Chernobyl unclaimed belongings. There are ghosts in the zone, but they aren't spirits. They're sweaters, dolls, forks, left mid-meal, books still open, shoes placed neatly beside beds that were never slept in again. These are the unclaimed belongings, and they are everywhere, frozen mid-story. Millions of objects that should have been taken in the rush, but were left behind like memories made physical. It made sense at the time. Residents of Pripyat were told they'd return in 3 days. They packed light essentials only. The rest would wait. But 3 days became forever, and what waited became something else. Now, the items haven't simply been abandoned, they've become relics. They've settled into the buildings like furniture in a mausoleum. A child's winter coat lies folded in a kindergarten closet. A typewriter sits with a half-written sentence in the cultural center. A chessboard remains in checkmate, dust gathered only on the black pieces. What's strange isn't that the objects remain, it's that some look moved, rearranged. Doors swing open to reveal a different configuration than weeks before. A backpack thought stolen reappears months later in a new location. These things weren't just forgotten. They're waiting. But for Humond, Y remains untouched, like the suitcase still resting by the door. The zone's unforeseen consequences. Chernobyl was never just one disaster. It was a seed of mutations, miscalculations, cascading effects that grew stranger with time. Some were expected: thyroid cancers, environmental collapse, generational trauma. But others were never on the list. Strange neurological disorders in mammals with no radiation markers, forests that bloom months ahead of schedule, migratory birds returning out of season, then vanishing entirely. Fungi that shouldn't exist, forming new biospheres inside sealed buildings. A specific brand of Soviet-era rubber boot now repels radiation more effectively than modern Gierno explanation given. Insects showing reversed sexual dimorphism. Rodents developing resistance to poisons that haven't been used in decades. Atmospheric shifts that affect only a 3-kilometer band, warping magnetic readings and scrambling drone GPS. And strangest of all, time anomalies, or the illusion of them. Watch batteries draining instantly. Digital clocks skipping minutes when within certain radii. People reporting lost hours that cannot be accounted for. Is it merely chaos, or is the zone reorganizing reality on its own terms? Because the true horror of Chernobyl isn't what we knew could happen. It's what we never thought to imagine until the land started inventing futures we were never meant to witness. The Chernobyl final moments. Everyone knows the time. 1 hour, 23 minutes, and 45 seconds, AM. But that timestamp is just a tombstone. The minutes leading up to it remain fragmented, obscured by panic, bureaucracy, and silence. The final moments inside Reactor 4 are less a chronology and more a puzzle with pieces deliberately shaved down to fit official narratives. Alarms were going off, but not the right ones. The operators followed a test protocol designed to simulate a failure only to trigger a real one, but certain logs went missing. Witnesses recall orders that weren't in the manual. One technician reportedly ran from the control room muttering, "It's already too late," 5 minutes before the explosion. The timing of the power surge still doesn't fully compute. The core's behavior in those seconds defied several established physical models. Some fragments of data suggest the explosion began a full second before the last human action, raising a grim question: was the system reacting to failure, or was the failure reacting to the system? It's like trying to reconstruct a dream while it's still burning. No camera survived. No testimony is entirely uncorrupted. Just a clock, just a number, and a world that still turns, while pretending it knows what really happened when the future cracked open.